and welcome. My name is Elizabeth Kleesner, and I am the Executive Director of Minnesota Brownfields. Relatively new to the position, started in November of 2021, and so it's great to do more in-person events and get to know all of you and meet you in person. Many of us have met over Zoom, so it's great to meet in person. Welcome to Bar Engineering, and thank you to Bar for being our forum sponsor today. Thank them for the great breakfast and later the lunch, and for letting us utilize this beautiful meeting space. We really appreciate Bar's sponsorship today. I'd also like to thank the Opus Foundation for underwriting the staff work that went with this event, and the foundation has been a generous contributor to Minnesota Brownfields. And because of the Opus Foundation contribution, we will have this material recorded and available to the public on the Minnesota Brownfields website. Just a little overview of what's to come today. The program committee at Minnesota Brownfields really felt that it was important to talk about financial literacy in the context of the increases in funding that we're seeing through the federal infrastructure law. And so the planning for this event started shortly after the law was passed almost a year ago. And we were thinking about how we can not only describe the new funding picture, but also think about where there might be gaps for both funding and policy, and understand how best to position not just Minnesota, or not just individual projects, but the state of Minnesota as a whole within the region, so that we are competing well for the funds that are available through the federal government and as they trickle into the state and local government partners. So really the genesis of this day is to walk through all the different levels of government and understand how people are prioritizing funding and what everyone is sort of hearing about the federal infrastructure law and how it's going to impact each level of government. So I hope that you find this to be a useful forum today. And with that, I'd like to introduce Eric Blodgett from Bar Engineering. Eric is a 15-year environmental engineer with lots of experience in public policy development related to vapor intrusion. He was a great resource for me when I first started, when we were talking about different PFAS issues. And Eric is also a part of the Minnesota Brownfields Programming Committee. Eric?
Thank you, Elizabeth. And I promise we didn't coordinate outfits. Just worked out that way. It was a coincidence, I swear. So hello, welcome everyone to BAR's Minneapolis office. On behalf of myself and all my colleagues at BAR, I want to say that we are glad to be hosting Minnesota Brownfields Financial Literacy Forum. And I wanted to start out with a little story. So this story, take yourself back to early March of 2020. So one of the things that I do as an environmental engineer is a lot of vapor intrusion work. And so I was excited about Minnesota Brownfields Vapor Intrusion Forum that they were going to put on annually. And I was particularly excited for the year in 2020 because BAR was going to host. We were going to host in this room that we're in right now. And so that event was planned for March 20th, 2020. So what could go wrong, right? I think we all know what happened next. March 13th, a state of emergency was declared in Minnesota because of the pandemic. And needless to say, we were not able to host that event. But it's not all doom and gloom. Fast forward to today, here we are, finally able to gather in person and share a meal and talk about all the cool and interesting brownfield projects that we've got going on. And so I just want to say that I'm glad for the mulligan that Minnesota Brownfields is giving us on this hosting opportunity. So I also wanted to take a little bit of time here at the beginning to share a bit about BAR's identity within the brownfield redevelopment space. And so we are a multidiscipline natural resources engineering firm. We've been doing investigation and cleanup of contaminated properties since the early 1970s. And so we've had a lot of opportunities to work on a variety of different brownfield projects all across the state of Minnesota. And so one could say that our work in this space started as early as the late 1970s with the Joslin Manufacturing Superfund site in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota. The investigation and subsequent cleanup at that site allowed for a multi-building, several 100,000 square foot commercial development, which is actually a key piece of the remedy for that Superfund site because it provides a cap and it limits the exposure pathways to site occupants. Carrying on through the 1990s and 2000s, we continued to work on many different brownfield redevelopment projects. Some notable ones include the New Brighton Exchange award-winning redevelopment project in the North Metro, very large project. One of my favorite projects actually at BAR for a couple reasons, one of which you can drink beer there, is the Surly Brewery. That was a very exciting redevelopment project for us to work on. More recent projects that we've had a chance to work on include the Redhead Mountain Bike Park in Chisholm, Minnesota, up on the Iron Range. It's a reclaimed mine project. And then also another very visible project is the Halls Island Graco Park on and actually in the Mississippi River in Minneapolis, where an island, a historic island, Halls Island, was recreated. And so I think those last two projects are actually a good example that demonstrate how brownfield redevelopment has the potential to directly benefit the public through revitalization of natural and recreational spaces. And so all these projects were challenging, very unique in their own ways, but they all have something in common. They all were made possible in part through local, state, or federal grant funding. And I didn't go through and tally up the hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions of dollars that those projects were awarded because we're lucky enough to have a current project that serves as a great example. This is a project that BAR is working on right now. My colleague Jenny Brecken is working with the City of Minneapolis and Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board on the Upper Harbor Terminal. So this is a project that's part of the riverfront revitalization effort that's going on in Minneapolis right now. And our friends at Hennepin County actually provided a $740,000 grant for this project. And so that's going to allow for a mixed use development that's going to reconnect North Minneapolis with the riverfront. It's going to provide places for folks to live and work. It's going to include a 20-acre park. And it's also going to include a community performing arts center. And so I think that last example is why I'm so glad that Elizabeth and her team are putting on this event today, because you know, there's no doubt that as we move forward, financial literacy and grant funding are going to continue to be a key piece of, I think, really any brownfield redevelopment project in Minnesota. So with that, I want to hope everyone got a chance to get some breakfast, and I want to thank you for attending the event, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you, Eric. I want to just take a quick minute to introduce Richard Manzer, who is on the Minnesota Brownfields Board of Directors and also works at the Opus Group. And Richard is going to just talk with you a little bit about the Opus Foundation, since they have been such a generous benefactor for this event.
Good morning, all. Good to see you all in person. First of all, most of you, I guess, know Opus as a design build construction company, based here in the metro. But a significant portion of our funds, of our profits, go to the Opus Foundation. The Opus Foundation was basically founded in 2000 in its current form, and since then have donated or have allocated about $43 million worth of funds to nonprofits. In addition, usually it comes out to currently about $3 million a year. So it's a significant amount of our profits that get redistributed through various nonprofits. One of the categories is community revitalization and development, and that's where some of the funding came from for today's program. So with that, thanks.
With that, we'd like to get started with our first panel, which will be a federal panel and will be moderated by Kristen Prosaski. Kristen is a Minnesota Brownfields board member. She's the organization's secretary, and she is a community development specialist with SEH. Kristen also has a lot of community development experience in Mankato and other communities in Minnesota, and I thought would be a great moderator for this particular panel because she just has a lot of great knowledge about how federal funding works and how federal funding interacts with specific local projects. So with that, I'd like to welcome up Kristen, along with Scott Nightingale from KSU TAB and Matthew Didier from US EPA Region 5 in Chicago. I'm having just a little trouble advancing the slides. Not sure if I'm doing something wrong or. It's my inherent ability to not any technology. Oh, thank you.
Oh, good morning, everybody. As Elizabeth said, I'm Kristen Prosaski. I have the pleasure of kicking off the morning with our federal funding panel. And our panelists are Matt Didier with US EPA Region 5. Matt is the Brownfield Project Manager. And along with Matt is Scott Nightingale, the National Tribal TAB Director and TAB Services Coordinator with Kansas State University's Technical Assistance to Brownfields program. So we'll kind of start things off with Matt and Scott, each covering information on their programs, going through some slides, and then we'll have time, quite a bit of time for Q&A, both some prepared questions, and then we'll make sure there's lots of time for audience questions as well. So I'm going to first turn things over to Matt.
Matt? Okay, we skip over that part. We've already talked about that. Hi, Matt Didier. Good morning. Be nice. I haven't done this in 2.5 years. My wife wants to give me a grocery list now. I send her upstairs and get on FaceTime because I can't even talk to people in real life anymore. So yeah, let's go through here. Going to talk real quickly this morning about EPA's brownfield grants. Some of the upshot of the infrastructure law. I know there's been some interest in that, how that's affected our grant funding starting last year, really, and going forward. So this year, our RFQ, our funding guidelines, probably going to go out early fall as they typically do. And we will be offering the full range of grants that were authorized to award this year, which is a first time. We have assessment grants in 3 different flavors there. Those are grants that our grantees use to investigate environmental conditions of properties. Often that's all you need to get a questionable property or one that people have been afraid of, back into circulation. We have cleanup grants, which is just what it sounds like. It's a direct grant that can be used for really any type of remediation that you need at a property. We have what are called revolving loan fund grants. These are larger awards that are meant to capitalize a fund with the grantee to then make loans or sub-grants that the recipient can use to do the cleanup. Hopefully it's a loan, so it gets repaid to the fund, not to EPA, it gets repaid to the grantee, and then there is a continuing source of money for brownfield work. And finally, we have multi-purpose grants, which is pretty much what it sounds like. You can use it for assessment, site cleanup, a lot of planning to develop, community-wide plans for your target area, the associated zoning updates. You can take care of that. If you are looking to do some kind of market analysis or promotion for your area, you can do that with those kind of grants. There are some new changes this year. We are going to have more funds available this year than we've had typically up till last year. There's going to be some language in the grant guidelines to make people aware that public involvement costs associated with running your public meetings, getting other groups involved in your program, that those are eligible costs. They've always been eligible. We're trying to point out that, make people really aware of that. The grants, because the grants have gotten larger, we're giving our grantees more time to complete the work. Yeah, those are probably the big things. I'm not going to go into the grants really closely. It's not enough time. This is not like how you write a good grant application. But after the RFQ funding guidelines come out, EPA always does a webinar with tips and suggestions for writing a grant proposal. And that'll happen probably within a couple weeks of when the funding guidelines go up. Really, the best way to find out what it's going to be is just keep checking back to the EPA Brownfields webpage, and there'll be a notice of the webinar there. Okay, I know as been said earlier, there's interest in the impact of the infrastructure law. The impact on the Brownfield program has been primarily and really exclusively to up the amount of money significantly that we have to award grants. The law did not give us any new funding authorization, so we have no new grant types. We're just pumping up the number of grants that we award and the amount of those grants. You can see here the additional amounts. So the competitive grants, the ones that are covered by our RFQ, those are up $1.5 billion over it's the I believe 5-year life of the infrastructure law. And our state and tribal response programs, these are this is funding that goes to states and tribes to just sort of continue their brownfield work. That's also going up by a significant amount. So here's sort of a scale of the increase. We awarded more than twice as many dollars, brownfield dollars, 2002 than we did in 2001. The job training grants starting this year are also going up. And over the life of the infrastructure law, we'll also be adding funds to our technical assistance programs and what we call targeted brownfield assessments. So these are a program where we will go out and do an assessment for applicants, and it does not require the people we're working with to actually manage a grant. You can get, if you have a site you really want to work on, come to us. We can probably help you deal with it, and you don't have to go through the process of trying to manage grants. So starting this year, we had 53% in the increase in the number of grants that we were awarded. As you can see, we had about a 220% increase in the total amount of the grants, and the average amount of each grant went up by about 40%. So this is a significant ramp up in money and availability of funds. This is great. For a long time, EPA was sitting at being able to fund a third or so of the applications we took in any one year. Starting last year, that number was up above half, probably close to 2/3. So it's greatly increased the chance that an applicant that shows up in grants.gov for us to look at is going to receive money. That said, some things are not changing. The processes and the things that we are going to consider in funding these grants are going to remain really stable this year. As you can see there, the law that authorizes our grants gives us 12 things that we have to consider in selecting our grants. Then EPA generally has a section for every grant application that requires the applicant to tell us about their experience or expertise in managing a grant. So these are 13 things that we've got to cram into our grant guidelines and have our applicants address. So consequently, yeah, we don't change our grant guidelines much from year to year. So if you've done this before, you'll know how to do it again. Can't get to the rest of my slides. They're hidden under this little pop-up box, so I can see myself talk saying I can't get to the rest of my slides. Let's try hidden. There we go. So having said that, we don't have new criteria. I know it seemed like there's much discussion at the Brownfield conference about emphasis on environmental justice and public participation. We don't have any new criteria called environmental justice. That's fine, because as long as these grants have been around, the 20 plus years they've been around, they've always had environmental justice considerations built into them. They weren't called environmental justice, but the concepts underlying environmental justice have always been there. So the grant guidelines ask applicants about what we call sensitive populations. The law says these include minority, children, pregnant women, low-income individuals. Now, this is integral to the idea of environmental justice. We look at the involvement of the local community, people near the brownfield sites. What's their involvement in making decisions about how the grant's going to be used? So we're looking for grant applications that have populations of sensitive communities where health outcomes are not great, and we want the people who are living there to be involved in the implementation of the grant. So you may not see, except in one little place, the words environmental justice, but the ideas, the important parts of it. It's there, it's always been there. That said, it's an important part, but it is not sufficient. So your grant proposal, your idea for a grant, it's not sufficient to say we've got an area with demographics that, you know, no one else is going to compete with. The EPA is going to look at this and there's no way that they could not select this grant because our need and our environmental exposures are so compelling. I'm here to tell you that that is one aspect of the selection project, and honestly, a relatively small part of the selection process once you start diving down into the guidelines to see how many points, to put it bluntly, you can get for different parts of the application. So you see there, you know, community need, which is where environmental justice is included. That's, you know, about 15% of your application. Community involvement, about 10% of the application. And if you look back, you know, these things have not really changed with a change in administration. These are, you know, still relatively the same weight and importance. You know, you compare that with, you know, the scope of work that you're going to describe and your budget for it. That's, you know, that's a quarter of the point right there. Your ability to manage grants, that's a fifth of your point. So you really, you know, have to go into this process if you're going to undertake it with a full, well thought out project. You can't, like I would say, simply think that your proposal can live and die on the demographics or environmental exposures in your target area. That said, we are trying to do some things again in the guidelines this year to sort of promote the idea or make our involvement with environmental justice that much more obvious. Again, we're making sure people know that what we call participant support costs are eligible. So if you have organizations that you want to be involved with your grant implementation and they're going to need some help covering their costs, that's an eligible expense. We're encouraging people to use EJ Screen and Council on Environmental Qualities screening tool in answering questions about demographics and environmental exposures. I would say this is, since it's in the guideline as a suggestion, I would say it's necessary. I would not say it's sufficient because we also have questions about incidents of disease, you know, observed health conditions that we want to know about that's not in EJ Screen. So you're not going to be able to just use EJ Screen as your source for replying to everything we want to know about community need and public health. That would be the end of mine. If I had to give you, I guess, one takeaway, it would be the program's got a lot more money, but selection criteria are pretty stable. And as you needed to have throughout the entire history of this program, you got to have a completely well thought out proposal that's going to address every aspect of the things in the funding guidelines. Yep.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Scott Nightingale. I'm with the Kansas State University Technical Assistance to Brownfields. Don't know how many of you are familiar with us or not. We do not give money out, unfortunately. We can't give you anything except for we do work under an EPA agreement. And one of the benefits of that is all of our services to communities are free. And that includes our partners, and I'll kind of go over some of that here. We help communities work on all stages of their Brownfields program, whether that's early, just identifying sites, building an inventory, whether that's applying for grants. As we're talking specifically about grant money here, when the guidelines come out, hopefully later this month or soon, there are 3 things that TAB can do for you specifically. We have a software called Tab EZ. If you've never written a grant application for one of these grants before, it will walk you through the different sections of the guidelines and help you get information put specifically for each question that's in there. We also have examples of past winning successful grant proposals. The ones on the EPA website from last year were supposed to come down on August 31st. I don't know if they're still there or not, but using old ones as you're applying for the next round, as Matt mentioned, a lot of this stuff stays the same from year to year. So using old successful ones as an example is a great idea on an idea of how to score well. And also, third thing, we provide a free review of your draft grant application. If you can get that to us, we can usually turn that around in 3 or 4 days. And we will have somebody that has experience, often past EPA staff, looking at this for you and offering comments on your draft application. In general, said we do technical assistance for communities that are doing brownfields. As you can see, that's not me. That is Beth Grigsby, and she is our TAB services provider centered for EPA Region 5, which includes Minnesota, of course. Contact her. You can contact me. We'll get you some help. We have a wide variety of services, as I mentioned, anything from early identification, inventorying your brownfields. We have some software you can use for that if you want to keep an inventory online, kind of a handy thing. We help people prioritize. We will do community meetings in your community. So excited to be back out in person in the communities. That's much better than the online ones. We can help you prepare your RFPs. When you do get that grant, we can help you prepare RFPs, get consultants on board. And basically anything related to brownfields, just ask us. If we can't do it, we'll let you know. If we have to get an expert to help you, we can do that. Speaking of which, we have oodles of partners with a variety of specific knowledge areas. We have folks that are experts in combining housing and brownfields projects. We have folks that do market analysis. And again, their services are free, just like ours are. With that, I'm going to be done with slides. Back up to that one so you can get best information if you want. And then I believe it's question and answer. All right.
Thank you both so much. I'm going to do a couple of questions, but then open it up to make sure that we have enough time for your questions as well. And Matt and Scott, I know I said I wouldn't throw you any curveballs, but I changed my mind at the last minute. I'm going to combine the first 2 questions. So everybody in our line of work is really excited about the federal funding that's been appropriated over the past year. There's been a number of appropriations, and we're all pretty thrilled about how that can positively impact our communities. So can you talk a little bit about what you're hearing about the infrastructure funding related to brownfield projects and how that might change how a local project sponsor might approach a grant application? Matt, would you mind answering that one first?
Yeah. It's really not going to change ours very much. Now, like I said, the infrastructure law just gives us more money to do what we've been doing for 20 plus years. And that's not really going to change. Not going to change what you are and are not allowed to do with the funds. It's not going to change our priorities for selecting grants. It's not fundamentally going to change what, well, not even fundamentally. I don't even think it's marginally going to change what we're going to be looking for in the scopes of work for the proposals. You know, how you're going to use the money. Going to use it for assessment money. Going to, you know, or use it to do cleanups. You're going to use it to do phase 1, phase 2 investigations, hazardous material surveys, do some planning, some community involvement. That's all things that we've been doing, again, as long as the grant program's been alive. We do have some marginal changes that I discussed in the funding guidelines to highlight particularly community involvement in the grants. That's not as a result of the infrastructure law. I'd say that's a result of just, you know, a change in agency view about the necessity of community involvement that would have occurred apart from the infrastructure law.
Thanks. And Scott?
Yeah. Couple things, you know, as Matt mentioned, can you guys hear me okay? I can't tell if it's, okay, good enough. You know, it's the same things, it's just more money coming into it. But with that, one thing we've noticed while helping communities is it's not just the Brownfields money or even just the EPA money. The infrastructure law has money coming through lots of different. There's money, you know, EDA, Department of Transportation, USDA Rural Development, Department of Energy, National Endowment for the Arts. Folks out there that all have funds that might be able to help you with your redevelopment project. So it's really kind of a key time with all the extra money to make sure you're working, you know, either within your own group or however, you know, if you're a smaller community, you might be somebody that does all this stuff. So if you're in a bigger community, you might have different departments that aren't used to working together. Well, maybe now's the time, you know, get with your housing folks if you're an environmental person or vice versa. You know, see what you can do together. Another thing, Matt mentioned an increase in the 128 money that's going to the states and tribes. With that, and are there some state folks here in the program? All right, great. You guys will probably cover this later, but some states with the extra 128 money are able to offer services directly to the communities. They're choosing to help directly with some cleanup projects or maybe assessments. It seems more cleanup because a lot of the assessments are being covered through the TBAs, targeted brownfield assessments. So some communities are having some luck approaching their state programs for some brownfields cleanups.
Great. Thanks, Scott. So I am going to open it up now for audience questions. Feel free to just raise your hand and we'll bring you a mic. Heidi?
Matt, I need maybe a tutorial or 101 on the multi-purpose. And the specific question is, can an application focus on one site, a transformational site, and with the understanding that the grant would be covering everything from planning to assessment, cleanup? Because what I'm more familiar with are the community area-wide types of grants.
I think the multi-purpose grants they were conceived as being used for an area larger than just a single site. That said, and so it's going to come with the funding guidelines, I'm sure will come with some requirements that the applicant assess a certain number of properties, you know, greater than one in a particular area. But the requirement for doing a cleanup believe extends to only one site. So, you know, if you have a priority site, you can certainly focus on it. But I don't think the grant application process is going to look great if that's the only site that you're looking at for your multi-purpose grant. I think you want to probably expand the target area at least a little bit around the priority site. You're probably also going to want to do that just so you'll be able to answer some of our questions about community need. You know, it's going to be tough to respond to some of those if your grant is really only about the property itself. So I think, you know, make that site a priority, look in an area around that, and, you know, it's likely that you're hoping, you know, our priority site is going to lead to some other development activities, and so we're going to do some investigation at nearby properties as well. So when our priority site kicks off, you know, we've got a leg up on supporting development associated with that site.
Scott, did you have anything you wanted to add or comment? Okay. Any other questions from the audience? Martha?
I guess this question is for Matt. I'm a little bit I've kind of lost touch with like EPA and how you refine your guidelines. So it's early in the year and you'll do a solicitation, I assume, later in the year. How much do you anticipate the kind of guidelines that you went through now changing between, is it kind of small tweaks that might occur as you get closer to, and you've kind of given us the big frame, just I guess in terms of somebody who might be applying and thinking about what that focus might be?
Yeah, so the funding guidelines for, you know, the ones that are coming up, those are the ones where I was discussing the slight changes regarding, you know, trying to make it more clear about community participation in the implementation of the grants. They're not out yet, so can't, you know, show specific language that's going to be in the guidelines, but again, they haven't changed much from last year. For better or worse, everybody can have their own opinion on that. Haven't changed a lot. What I've been talking about today is really all based on what I've seen about the new guidelines that will be coming soon.
Yeah, I might jump in on that. It's not too early to start just because the guidelines aren't out. Some of the information, it's statutorily driven. It's going to be the same every time. We've actually already reviewed a few applications that people have drafted based on last year's, knowing they're going to have to change them a little, but they've already gotten going. So you can start getting your demographic information. I don't think the information on EJ screen is going to change between now and then enough. You can't start grabbing that. You know, there's a lot to do to put one of these together. So yeah, go ahead and get started before the.
I did, you know, there are some places in the draft where I just, you know, checked this year's language against last year's language, and it has not changed at all. So, and I'm guessing that's probably most of the things that you'll be responding to have not, you know, commas are in the same place and every word's the same.
Thank you. I'm Amy Hattieris with the MPCA Brownfield program. I just want to give a shout out to KSU TAB. Man, we love you guys. When we write a grant application, we use that software that was mentioned, and I can't imagine writing one of these grant applications without using that software. So if you are contemplating writing an application, you really just need to use that free software. It's really easy. You just register an account and boom, you're in. Another nice feature of it is it does tell you the point value of each of the questions too, so you kind of, know where to focus your efforts. Yeah, so I just wanted to say that. That great job. We always run our draft grant applications through the KSU tab review process, and the feedback that they've given us has really been invaluable, and I'm quite sure improved the quality of our grant application.
Oh, I was just going to say thank you. And even if you're having a consultant prepare your application, we'll still do the review. I mean, it's for folks that are using consultants or not. However, we're happy to do it.
Go through, and maybe this is clarifying what I said earlier. There are sections with more points, sections with less points, but you got to deal with all of them, regardless of what the stated point value is. Because, when we review these things, everything gets a numeric score, and then we just go down the list until the money runs out. And so every year there's, the person with the lowest score who gets money is right here. And then there's somebody who got 1 point, 2 points less. So some of these things are worth more than others, but you can't ignore anything because the cutoff between all the money that you can apply for and zero, can come down to 1 point.
Yeah, I know Matt mentioned there were, a higher fraction got funded last time because of some increases. It's still very competitive. I think assessment grants were 160 points possible, and I believe some folks that scored 154 didn't get a grant. There's not much leeway. You need to do it all.
Yeah, much of a surprise because, like I said, this is the same funding guidelines from year to year. They haven't even changed that much over 20 years, and if they do, they change in little increments. So, I mean, if you're an applicant, you know what's coming. If you're an applicant from a previous year and you weren't successful, you can call us and we'll tell you how to make your proposal better. So by now, everybody should be, and if you want, they'll give you ones that were successful in previous years. So, the teacher's answer sheet is out there. We'll tell you what to do, and the test isn't really going to change from last year.
I'm new to grant writing, so how would you measure the applicant's ability to manage a grant? You said that was one of the really big criteria you look at, especially if maybe they haven't managed a grant before or haven't managed that many in the past.
Well, the thing I would first tell you to do is go find the guidelines from last year, because that's going to tell you exactly what to answer. The other thing that I can tell you is, when you're talking about your experience in managing a grant, it doesn't have to be an EPA grant. It doesn't even have to be a federal or a state grant. If somebody gave you money, we think that's a grant. And probably the one thing you really want to avoid is saying, we've never had a grant. So come up with some kind of financial assistance you've gotten from somebody and, use that experience to respond to the funding guidelines. Because I think in the past, and I'm not sure if it's still the same, but in the past, if you tell us you've never managed a grant before, you cannot get as many points as everybody else who has managed a grant. So you're starting yourself at a numeric disadvantage. And, if you've got 10 points that you can essentially lose and still get money, and all of a sudden half of those have gone because you said you haven't managed a grant, that's going to be a problem for you. So think of something that you've done before. So it's not a sufficient response to say, we're going to hire X consultant or X other organization to run this for us, because, our grantees are our grantees. They are responsible for every nickel of the money and every activity that goes on. So when I'm looking at these things, all I want to know is, you say this contractor is going to help you. Well, I don't know anything about this contractor. And even if I did, that's not my question, because our deal is with you, the grantee, not any subgrantee or contractor that, you might highlight in the proposal. Now, that said, you can have these other organizations help you with the implementation of the grant. They're going to be able to help you prepare the reports. They're obviously going to have to do the inventory. They can help you, or the invoicing. They can help you run public meetings if you want. They can do a lot of things for you that aren't just doing cleanups or environmental investigations. But when it comes to telling us about your ability to manage a grant, tell us about your organization.
Any
I
other?
actually have a quick question that, because this has come up quite a bit in the National Brownfield Steering Committee as well. I think we all know there can be really significant economic barriers to public participation surrounding a particular project and getting people involved who are impacted by a project. Can you say a little bit more about what the specific eligible costs would be now for people to participate? Is it transportation costs? Is it something related to just being able to facilitate gathering community members, language barrier issues? I'm just wondering what EPA is thinking about in terms of eligible costs to increase public participation.
Well, first of all, I would, again, scrub the guidelines, because in there it's probably either in the guidelines or in the FAQs, which I would definitely recommend you look at. Click on the link in your funding guidelines for FAQs. There's a lot of information, and I've been doing this a long time. I still use these FAQs because they go into like serious detail. So these eligible costs are going to cover things, definitely transportation. Probably going to require, it probably allows, a stipend. So if you're using another organization or even an individual to help you organize a meeting, promote it, put together material to make people know about the event or that you'll use during the event, those are eligible costs for a person to, be compensated for their time. A couple things you have to remember: it can only be something directly related to the grant. So, if you're applying for one of these things, don't just throw in your budget, we're given X amount of money to people to do this. You got to budget this closely. You got to go out, figure out how much you're willing to provide in participant costs, and what you think is a reasonable amount to support these with some justification. This is one of those things. We have a 20-year history when it comes right down to the who's going to be looking at your proposal. People are looking at your proposal have a lot of experience in assessing quality of a proposal and the budget when the things in it are, we're doing phase 1 assessments, phase 2 assessments. This is how much we're planning to spend on these things. It's like, okay, we know this. This seems reasonable. We can understand what's going on. These participant support costs, I don't know how many people will take advantage of them. Like I said, they've always been eligible, but we haven't highlighted it before. If you're going to do that, you got to budget those things, in detail, because that's going to be a new thing for the majority of the reviewers. And, when you're writing one of those things, it's beyond this aspect. Do not assume that the person reading this knows anything about your community. You know, we get the way they score these things. It has multiple reviewers, only one of whom is from the office in Chicago. You know, so every year when I do this, I'm getting applications to read from, you know, say small towns. In the last few years, I keep ending up with Region 4. So I'm getting applications from small towns in South Carolina and Georgia that maybe I've heard about them, maybe I haven't, but I know nothing about it. So, you know, really don't assume that anybody is gonna, even these big cities, you know, like large city that obviously everybody knows just from living in America that it's a city that has serious economic problems. You know, you can't just assume that you're going to drop an application and just because everybody knows my big city has been in dire straits for years, I don't have to really answer a lot of these things specifically because the reader's just going to know that, you know, they've seen my city on the news as long as they've been working at EPA, and that's really all they need to know about me.
Oh, all right, we'll do one. Yeah, one more question.
I was curious on the change in regulatory status on a couple of PFAS compounds here, whether you know, EPA is looking at the range of pollutants and contaminants, and whether you already have had a history of doing assessment grants specifically for PFAS related impacts, and what that might look like, given that some are regulated on a federal basis, or very soon will be, and as hazardous substances, and others not, and whether there's any distinction or importance there.
Going to say that in the assessment grants, when you're doing, if you're doing a phase 2 for a site, PFAS is among the analytes that I think you could include in a phase 2 investigation. When it comes to cleanup, the eligibility of an action just to deal with PFAS, I'm not sure that's eligible yet, simply because, no, last time I looked, EPA did not have, for lack of a better word, a cleanup level that we could use to define when some type of environmental media is contaminated with PFAS. The cleanup grants, I think there's more of a question. But the other thing is, like, if you're dealing with the site and you've got PFAS, you may be undertaking some remediation activities that you're already doing to deal with sites that are known hazardous substances. So, you know, you might get to deal with your PFAS cleanup just because you can't really segregate that from other contaminants in the media that you're dealing with. I mean, if you got PFAS contamination in soil, you may well have other things that we know you can definitely deal with. So your PFAS cleanup may just be a bonus that you get as part of, you know, what you would be doing. Otherwise, even if, you know, the regulatory status of PFAS was really clear at the federal level. Before we're done here, I wanted to, we've got one of my colleagues here, Eric, and he and I will be around the rest of the day through the breaks and lunch. So if you had a question that you didn't get an answer, you didn't want to ask in front of the whole class, then, you know, just come up, talk to us. We're pretty friendly, even though we're federal government employees.
I want to give a huge thank you to both Matt and Scott for being here today.
I'd like to call up the state funding panel, please. And Elizabeth Schmiesing is our moderator for this particular panel. Elizabeth is the Minnesota Brownfields Board of Directors president. She is a partner at Winthrop and Weinstein and has a long history of working with state regulatory agencies across Minnesota state government. So I thought she would be a great person to lead this panel discussion to talk about how state of Minnesota is approaching infrastructure funding and how the state agencies are going to be working together. As Scott said, there's lots of new agencies kind of in the game as it relates to both brownfields and the infrastructure law itself. And it's such an interesting and dynamic time to be a practitioner in this area. And, I think based on some of the feedback from what we heard in the federal panel, one question that kind of comes up is maybe perhaps this is a unique time to think about a new project that you might not have thought about as a potential funder in the past. And with that, I'd like to introduce Elizabeth Schmiesing.
Good morning, everybody. So our panel today, we've got folks from Department of Transportation, DEED, and the PCA. We've got Kristen Lukes who's the Director of Brownfields and Redevelopment at the Department of Employment and Economic Development. We've got Shanna Schmidt from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and Michelle Waters, the Environmental Investigation Unit Supervisor, Contaminated Materials Specialist from the Minnesota Department of Transportation. And I believe that everybody's going to talk a little bit about their programs, and then we will do some Q&A. So did you guys decide who wants to go first? Oh, I guess it's already set up by the way the slides are. So looks like Michelle goes first. All right.
Yeah, it is me. Look at that. Good morning, everybody. I'm Michelle Waters with MnDOT. The group that I am part of is our contamination group. We are part of a larger office, the Office of Environmental Stewardship, and then we've got a bunch of subunits. So I'm going to show that here in a minute. But those are our websites. That's the contamination website, and the broader environmental group. We have wetland specialists, we have threatened and endangered species specialists, we've got stormwater people, we've got a whole cast of people over there. I like to cross-market for our other groups. There's my phone number and whatnot. So again, this is our broader group. We are a big office inside of MnDOT. We've got a handful of different specialties. The longer one that's there in the red is the group that I work in and supervise. And then the one next to us that's a little bit shorter is our regulated group as well. We used to all be in one broader group. As you can tell, it's a lot of people. So we split apart about a year and a half ago. So our regulated group who does the asbestos, the lead, PCBs, those sorts of waste products, as opposed to the contamination group, which is soil, groundwater, vapor. Make sure everybody knows what's going on over there. Yeah. We do a lot of corridor work. We do phase 1s, phase 2s, site investigations. We do construction monitoring in that we are cleaning up our road projects and our corridors. We're not doing source area investigations or traditional LSIs. We do lots and lots of sampling and testing. These are some of our recent projects. We do whole communities. We do the entire town of Waseca, the entire town of Blooming Prairie, the entire town of Halleck. We do these in the metro as well, but I like to highlight some of our smaller communities that we go through. Anytime that a trunk highway is Main Street, we own Main Street, and that does. And so when we come through and we do road projects, we are digging up the stormwater structures. So I'll get back with the funding mechanisms and the federal bills, but there's a lot of resiliency and environmental climate change and whatnot that's happening with some of that federal money that's potentially coming. And some of that is doing resiliency. So we are upsizing our stormwater culverts and some of our other features like that. And we're upsizing some of our bridges and whatnot to accommodate more flash flooding and groundwater that is coming in these more intense rainstorms. And so when we're doing that, we're coming through these communities and doing all the stormwater structures as well. We're also, potentially replacing the city's utilities, so water and sanitary. When we're in there messing up the roads, they like to take advantage of the fact that somebody else let's tore up the road and we'll put it back together for them. And so we partner with these communities to do the public utilities as well. And so we're doing often big excavations, 10, 15 feet deep through here. And so we are doing cleanup, but we're doing it within the road corridor. We're not doing offsite remediation. But we do go out and look at the adjacent properties. If we are buying land on the backside of the sidewalks because we need working space, we are doing remediation up through the edge of our project limits. And we are also, and I'll get to this later, but we're also doing phase 2 investigations behind the sidewalks and in our shoulders and in our roadways. And so I know a lot of you guys have clients that have properties that are adjacent to the roadways, and you're often looking for offsite borings. Does the contamination that they've potentially caused spread across the street or into the roadway? We have a ton of data. So we've got a data practices website that I've got up here as a resource for later. But come ask us for data. Once our phase 2s and our construction implementation reports are final, they're considered public data. And so you can file a data practices request, which is the state version of a FOIA, and ask us for them. We are obligated to give them to you. But I like to advertise that because I think it's an underutilized resource that we can provide to the broader community. So here's a couple other resources. I know that a lot of people here work on MnDOT projects and your teams do, but there's a couple other resources out here. We do have a pre-qualification list. And so if you want to be doing phase 1s, phase 2s, construction cleanup on MnDOT projects, you got to be on the pre-qual list. There's the link for that. I think most people in here are, most of the companies are, but as a reminder, we do have that. There's lots of other pre-qualifications. If you do wetland work, if you do the asbestos abatement stuff, we have all of those different work types are on here. I think there's upwards of 40 or 50 different types. And so I know a lot of the companies you guys all work for have different service sectors outside your environmental groups. You can be on many, many lists. Other spot is people ask us often questions we field about, when's the next big project coming out? When can I bid on your next big project? So there is a notice website for LOIs, so letters of interest, and RFPs, the request for funding proposals. So those go out on a website and they get posted kind of as they come available. There's not like a certain date. We don't have a funding here. They just, as the projects evolve, they get posted. So it's just rolling all year long. So continuing that. And those are for the big projects. Those are for, a lot of those are the engineering design that happen on our projects. But we do sometimes have some big environmental work that is not just contaminated, but other cultural resources, our archaeology groups, and some of our other big groups go out for the larger contracts as well. The data practices, like I mentioned, so that's the state version of the FOIA request. If you're looking for data from my group, from the contamination group, or any of our other ones, just put right in there. I'm looking for something along Trunk Highway 4 in the community of Halleck. Please send this to the environmental team. They'll route it right to us. The other piece with that is the offsite borings. So often we have to look at, is the contamination spreading across the street? Is it into the shoulder? Is it into the ditch? There is a way, there's a permit to do it. It sounds big and scary, but it's actually not that bad. But that's the website for the permit. The permits typically take, once they get into the system and get routed, we get 2 weeks to approve them. So you do have to plan accordingly with your utility locates and whatnot. They do need to be sent in at least 2 weeks ahead of time in order for us to approve them if you have a driller on the schedule. That's it.
All right, I guess that means I'm up. I'm Kristen Lukes at the Department of Employment and Economic Development, and I was told one slide. So I had prepared one slide, and none of them have like my contact information or any websites or anything that would have been, really useful for you. But this slide's really useful for me because then I know what I'm going to talk about. So I'm sure you can find me, but I'm just going to talk about some of our main programs, and I don't have a org chart of our organization, but I can tell you that our Brownfields and Redevelopment Office is housed within our Community Finance Office, which is housed within our Economic Development Division of DEED. DEED's a huge agency with many different facets to it. So we're just a little tiny cog in the giant wheel. So our main brownfield program areas that most of you are familiar with are our cleanup and investigation grants that we give out, and also our redevelopment and demolition grants that we offer. Just to give a little plug, I'm going to talk a little bit about these programs and just give some general information, but we are having a webinar tomorrow at 12:30. If you go on our website or Met Council's website, you can find links to that, and that'll give you a far more in-depth discussion on our cleanup and investigation programs. But before I get into those, I just want to talk about a couple other programs that may or may not relate, or maybe you haven't thought of how they might relate to a Brownfields program because they're not necessarily cleanup or those like site prep kind of costs. But because we are in the community finance area, we do have some infrastructure funds through our TEDI program, which is our Transportation Economic Development Infrastructure Program. We have BDPI. We have acronyms much like the MPCA for everything. Our Business Development Infrastructure. So a lot of those programs will do like infrastructure interchanges if they relate to future economic development. We can run infrastructure out to like industrial parks, but it's all kind of in the name of jobs. We have our host community program. We also have direct business, a lot of direct business grants if you're working with someone who's looking at developing on a site. There's a lot of Minnesota Investment Fund, job creation, the new Main Street monies, and lots of different funds. We also, if you don't fit into any of the categories that we have in our department, one mechanism is a special appropriation, and many of those are administered through our community finance program. So those are direct legislative appropriations, usually to cities. But the ones that pertain most closely today are, again, our investigation and cleanup funds. We have state money that we can do both investigation grants. We like those investigation grants to kind of go through the wrap stage if a cleanup is necessary. So we don't, for instance, you can't get a grant just to do a phase 1. We would want you to go through that testing phase. And then we also have money, grant money, state grant money to do actual cleanups. We also have an RLF from EPA that we have some funds expiring soon. So if you have some needs, see me right away because I need to get that money out the door really fast. So all of our grants that are in these kind of main program areas, they all are geared toward not necessarily the cleanup. I mean, we do give cleanup money, but we're most interested in what you're going to put there when your cleanup is done. So we look at kind of jobs, taxes, all those economic benefits. Our grants go to public entities, so you don't have to own the property, but you do have to go through a local unit of government, city, county, HRA, that kind, to get a grant. Most of our grant funds have a match component. For our cleanup and investigation funds, it's 75% grant, 25% match. Sorry if you got scared there for a second. Our grants are competitive. For cleanup and investigation, we do grants every 6 months. Our next one is November 1st, and we typically have about $4 million because of COVID and some things slowing down a little bit. We typically have a little more than that, and we tend to fund a good share of the grant applications that come in. So then just quickly, the other kind of program area that is more pertinent to the kinds of projects that you all probably work on is our redevelopment and demolition. So I always kind of think of it as the contamination cleanup program is sort of the underground stuff, the soil and groundwater and vapor cleanups. And then the redevelopment and demo is kind of the above ground stuff. So mostly demolition, site prep. We can do some infrastructure and we can sometimes do some like geotechnical soil stabilization stuff, but primarily if you just kind of look at it that way, they're both site prep programs. So redevelopment and demo are also competitive. They also are based on that end development. We usually have about $2 million a grant cycle for those programs, and those run on opposites. So our cleanups is May and November, and then our redevelopment is February and August. So every 3 months, there's some kind of grant program going on of these programs. So Yeah, I mean, I think I'm just going to end it at that because I know there's a lot of burning questions and I know we're just a little bit behind. So I'll turn it over to Shauna.
Okay, so the PCA, we have a couple grants available right now. Our traditional one is what we call the Minnesota Targeted Brownfield Assessment Program, or TBA. The same acronyms that Region 5 uses for their Region 5 Targeted Brownfield Assessment Program. So they're all TBAs, but it's assessment work. So phase 1s, phase 2s, hazardous building surveys, preparing the cleanup plan will take you all the way through that stage. That money is typically about $90,000 a year, and that's money that we get from EPA every year to help run our programs. And so we choose to do a subgrant and do assessment work. You don't have to own the site; you just have to have access to the site. So we need a signed access agreement from the property owner. There is no match. There are no deadlines for the applications. We're currently still going on a rolling basis. So it's a little bit different than the programs at DEED, but that's what we have. That's our regular thing. And the application is simple, right? So we try to keep it very easy. And a little bit of a note. So when we do the assessment work, that work is done by one of our state multi-site contractors, the remediation contractors that are chosen every 5 years. And so they do all the work. The PCA does all the grant management. You bring the site in, we work out when we're gonna come with the contractors and do the work, and then you get a report at the end. That's it. So if you don't have time to manage a grant, it's okay, right? This is perfect. We have a new grant, right? So Matt was talking about some of the increase in money that we're seeing from the bipartisan infrastructure law, and that's what we got last year. So we applied last year, I'm sorry, and we receive it right now. So this new grant that we have is it's a statewide assessment grant. We're focusing on environmental justice areas. It's $2 million over 5 years. So it's a really significant amount of money. As I said, there's an EJ focus. We also want to see sites that are somehow community driven, or that there's been some sort of community involvement. People know what's going on, they're excited about it, or they have a need for whatever's going in, that sort of thing. Our TBA application is being revamped. So it's no longer going to be the TBA application. It's just going to be the Brownfield Assessment Grant application. One application will decide which pot of money works best for your site and go forward. So both the grant monies we're going to go on a rolling basis. And so it's a 4-page application that includes our 4th page, which is a template, a start of your cover letter. So it's really 3 pages. So it's a lot of checking the boxes, yes and no, and it's meant to be very easy to do. So we want someone on a neighborhood group to be able to fill it out. You don't have to get extra help to do that sort of thing. So I put the updated web page on there. I know this stuff will be available later, but if you can't find it, you just email me, I'll send you the link. We are getting a new website at the PCA, right? They're redesigning it, it's very exciting. This link will still work. So I did ask, she told me yes, it will still work out. So the new website's gonna roll out in the next 2 weeks, I think is what we heard. Something along those lines. So, and the new application that I'm talking about, we're literally reviewing the last draft right now. So that should be done by the end of the week, early next week, and up online. I wanted to make sure people knew how to sign up for our Gov delivery list so you can stay updated. We're going to start sending out notices about our new grant when it goes live October 1st. All sorts of other updates you'll get from there. So that Gov Delivery sign up link is at the bottom of every single PCA webpage. So if you can't remember, just go to the website, look down at the bottom, there it is, and you can sign up for the remediation updates. There's a bazillion other ones you can sign up for as well. And then the last one is just my contact info. Wait, there's no networking break yet. Hold on. Now it's time for questions.
Well, thanks to all our panelists. Much as Kristen did, I'm going to start out with some questions and then open it up to the audience. One thing I'm curious about, Shauna, is you talked about the new grant being focused on environmental justice. Our EPA speaker talked about sensitive areas. Is PCA going with a different definition of environmental justice, or is it going to be similar to what was discussed?
It's a little bit of both.
Okay.
So the PCA, we have our own environmental justice screening tool. It's called EJ Screen. Google it, it comes right up, and you can put in the address, you see the area, and it has a couple criteria. It has people of color, it has poverty levels, and then it has tribal areas. So those are the three basic main indicators of environmental justice. There's different thresholds for each, except for tribal area, you're either it or not. The EPA screening tool, they have it, the EJ screen tool, right? And then they have that other screening tool that Matt had up there that I can't remember all the acronyms for, but it has a lot of other indicators too, some of the health indicators. So we'll use either the EPA's screening tool or ours. They're going to be the same. The EPA one just tells you things like, are you in a food desert? Do you have higher incidences of asthma, different things like that. So we're still just using the three basic criteria. Yes, Matt has something to add. The microphone is coming.
So just, and this applies to all of our grants. In the proposal process, we're going to ask you a bit about how you're actually going to select the sites where you end up spending our money. I'll ask you a bit about that. Mostly want to see if what you're planning to do with our grant is consistent with broader planning documents that you have. But EPA does not get involved in the specific selection of sites that our grantees are going to spend money on, and we don't give them any criteria that they have to use to make those decisions. They're largely up to our grantees. So if MPCA is planning to have more of an EJ focus than maybe some of our other grantees may be more, really looking hard at sites that have shown economic development potential. That's great. That's good with us. We're not ever going to tell you you can't use that site because it doesn't meet our priority for where you spend our grant funds.
No, that's okay. And all the screening tools go by census tract, right? So if you have a site that's coming in and you're right on the border of one, or you're a fourth of a mile away, but you have all the other things are looking good, like you have a strong community-driven thing, like maybe you're putting in a new community center or a grocery store because there isn't one anywhere else, or something like that, then yes, it would still be considered. So yeah, there are lots of nuances as always.
So I'm curious, each of your perspectives on this. From your vantage point, how do all of the different levels of government function to make brownfield project dollars accessible to everybody? We've heard from feds. We are going to hear from local government a little bit later this morning. That's something that I've always found a bit of a puzzle, is how do all these pieces of funding work together? I don't know who would like to start.
Yes, I do.
So with our, again, we do have some federal money. So we're kind of the go-between, I sort of feel like, because we have federal money that comes into us, we have state money that comes to us, and all of our grants go to the local units of government. I know oftentimes we get asked about community involvement, and since all of our projects have to go through the local process, we know that the locals are involved with our projects. They're have their fingers, you know, in the project. There's many other parts, as you guys know, to the projects in terms of city regulations and planning documents and approvals. So at least we know that all of our projects have gone through kind of that community process through the locals.
Yeah, sure. I can add to that. So we talk, right, as higher level units of government. We actually have good relationships with several local units of government, but we're a state agency, right? We can't talk to every city in the state or even every county on a regular basis. It's just not possible. But part of what we're doing with some of our increased funding is we plan to hire 2 community outreach and engagement personnel, right? So that's going to be their job. They're going to be much better at it than we as technical staff are, right? That's their jam. We're also going to be finishing up a community action plan, community communication plan to go along with that to help us in those efforts of reaching out to different communities. We also are planning to provide a resource on our website, like all the different state funding tools, or not just state funding tools, all the funding tools available in the state. So there's a SWAMO document coming out. SWAMO is just a group of states and territories. They're coming out with an EPA funding fact sheet, all the federal funds that are available that somehow intersect with brownfields. So that's not out yet. It'll be coming soon. We'll put out an email blast when it is, but we want something similar for the state. So Minnesota Brownfields has something they've had on their website for a long time. So we're going to just expand right on that and really bring in maybe some of this new money that's coming out of the bipartisan infrastructure law, that when it starts trickling down in all these strange and wonderful ways.
We, I mean, that we don't specifically, you know, have grant programs or give out money in the way that some of the other groups do, but we do have some interesting partnerships that are gaining traction and are becoming, we're trying to make them more visible. We have our state aid and our cooperative construction projects on the counties and city roads when they intersect the trunk highway. We do a lot of work on that projects. But we also have projects like the recent one that is going on in downtown Minneapolis near the A, B, and C ramps. There's a public art installation that's going on, and a skate park that's going in, and some of that is on MnDOT land and some of it's on a local's land, and so we're partnering in that capacity. And I think that there are some other grants or funding mechanisms that happen through the local agencies there. We also have a highway local community partnership that we do when we are putting in new landscaping or community beautification projects. If you've got a small town that has one of those big welcome signs, those are often on MnDOT property, and so we are working with the local neighborhood groups and community groups that want to put those signs out in the right of way so that the traveling public can see that that community is there and in case you get off on the exit. And so some of that is funded through grants and whatnot. It's just not a specific group that I work in. They are out there.
Great, thanks. Let's open it up to questions from the audience. Heidi?
Okay, Kristen, I want to help you use up that revolving loan fund. So whereas the grant programs you talked about, you said that the applicants need to be units of government. For the revolving loan fund, I'm correct in understanding that those would be developers, projects that are looking for gap financing? And that's EPA money, and EPA money, as I've used it in the past, does touch hazardous material remediation.
Such as asbestos?
Well, I mean asbestos, lead,
Sure.
that type of thing, like your redevelopment grant program will touch. And finally, are you considering any sub-grants within your revolving loan fund?
Yes, I am. I'm not sure the amount right now because of EPA's, they have some restrictions on how much subgrant you can give out of your whole grant, out of your whole cooperative agreement amount. And so I'm working with our Region 5 person right now to try to figure out how much of my, I think I have about 1.3 million left of original funding that I could lose. How much of that I can subgrant is a mystery right now.
And when would you like to have that used up by?
The end of the year.
I think our EPA guest would like to address that.
Developers and other private companies eligible for loans. Subgrants, no. Subgrants can only go to units of government or not-for-profits.
Other audience questions? Oh, hang on. All right, other audience questions? I find this surprising.
I have a question.
Oh, there's somebody else. Yeah.
But it's less of a question, more of a, well, it's a question to the group up there, but also maybe to the EPA as well as the people that are going to go about the more local grants. One of the situations that our company continues to run into is the reopening of soil vapor issues and vapor intrusion into with small businesses in the city where, you know, sometimes it's the site assessment group at the PCA that comes through and all of a sudden they're left with, oh, you have to remediate your building, even if they've got a no association determination for soil. And so there's a lot of building owners out there that are tasked with, you know, $30,000 to $200,000. A lot of times that they have to, you know, they have 30 days that they have to come up with the money to mediate or whatever. And the PCA has been great working with these people to understand the financial difficulties, but there is no mechanism. There's no grant money for these people, and they're because they don't create jobs or whatever. These building owners or apartment owners are left kind of stuck. And I don't know if that can be part of the conversation today to help some of those owners.
Yes. So there's kind of two prongs, right? One of it is sites that are identified through kind of our area-wide site assessment work, right, where we're working on vapor releases, identifying all these properties, and we can only pay to remediate residential, you know, single-family homes, right? Businesses, they just have to do it on their own. But as part of our grant funding, part of some of the extra funds we're going after is to be able to have some cleanup money. It's never going to be a lot, not until we get state cleanup money, hopefully happening someday. But just enough to do smaller cleanups. So if it's like it's a small business, like I had a site on Lake Street, right, that is an old whatever, many uses, but now they're installing car stereo systems, right, and they needed to do some vapor work. So we could pay for something like that, right? That could be part of a grant. So we're edging into it, but we're not to the point where we would have grants that would cover all the situations, right? We're trying to get some for just this brownfield grant work, and then you know, we know there's more need out there. So
Thank you. Any other questions? I think, Elizabeth, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask kind of a macro 30,000 foot question, which, you know, we hear, you know, in the news from our federal government friends that, you know, there's more money in the system through the infrastructure law. can you give a perspective from each of your state agencies about what that's meaning to you? I think we have a pretty good feel for where MPCA's extra sort of programming is coming from, but maybe Kristen and Michelle, can you give us a feeling for sort of what's new at your state agencies because of the infrastructure law? I think that's one of the things we're trying to understand here today.
Yeah, I can start. So we've fielded this question a bunch. Being a DOT, being transportation, it's infrastructure transportation. So we got this question a lot earlier this summer. The legislators have money sitting on the table, but ran out of time and it didn't have a special session. And so some of that money that is available was not authorized. The budget's there, but we did not get signatures and they didn't sign anything. So we are waiting until they come back in the next session. Our understanding is that there's going to be that money is available for up to 10 years. There's going to be 9 more cycles that we can get this money from. Of the programs that are funded, there are 375 programs in the IIJ or IIJA bill. 125 of those programs, of the 375, are brand new programs that are being made, like literally right now. And so there's a lot of confusion about what's happening. There's money that is there that is federally authorized, and then there's a bunch of other money that has to be allocated by the state. And so there's some discrepancy back and forth about who can use that money and when it's coming. At this point, the DOT for our road projects hasn't been authorized any of that. We're waiting until they sign the bills. The big pieces that are in them for the MnDOT stuff are Safe Streets for All. The network of EV chargers is going to be a big one, and some climate resiliency stuff, like I mentioned earlier, with upsizing a lot of our stormwater capacity, those kinds of projects. We are also modernizing and expanding rail and freight, which is tangentially related here in the Twin Cities. Met Council is also involved with that with Metro Transit. Airport improvements, that's both the MAC, but also our really small regional airports. And then each one of our regional district offices, so our Rochester office, our Duluth office, our Mankato office, each one of those has got a list of projects kind of shelved that if and when this money is available, that they will push those projects forward. A lot of them are big bridge projects. Up in Duluth, we've got a big one. It's the Blotnick Bridge. It's the crossing that goes over into Superior. And we've got big projects like that that are waiting and are being designed and sort of getting shelved, and we're getting so far with our internal money, and then they're going to sit there until we can get the federal money to push it across the finish line. Yeah.
All right, this will be easy for me because 100% of the money coming out of that bill going to our department is going toward our statewide broadband efforts.
I spoke about most of it. There's probably other infrastructure funds going to other areas of the agency, not just the Brownfield program. I know there will be some extra money for PFAS work. There's going to be some extra money trickling down to our super fund and site assessment programs, and we just don't know all of that yet.
All right. I would like to ask one more question, if that's okay, if we're cutting into our break tiny bit. So I'm just curious, this is not quite lightning round, but a brief explanation of a favorite success story of a project for each of you, and if there's any interesting or unique funding aspect to how the project was done.
They're all my favorite.
Nobody has a favorite shot.
One of our,
I know.
One of our, make me laugh. One of our really early TVA projects was the Wilder Square site. So that's a site in Frogtown. Some of you know that area of St. Paul. Back in the day, they mined out the sand and gravel, and then they filled it with a dump. And then in the 60s and 70s, they built housing. This particular area of housing is very low income housing. It consists of high-rise apartments, townhomes, and some row homes. right? So we came in and we did some work. We knew the dump was there because another brownfield site had gotten started. So we started doing some work, and they needed some soil vapor mitigation. And so we didn't have any money for that at that time. So we were able to cobble it together through some other strange ways. But yeah, it was a good one. They're finally finishing up their third phase of soil remediation. It's been a long road, probably 8 years it took. Long time.
Nice. So for me, again, I don't have favorites either. Although I do have to agree with Eric that Surly might be one of my favorites. But the 8-year project ones, well, I have to admit, those aren't my favorites.
Yeah, we have, so we do less remediation and more just cleanup of our construction projects, but we have partnered on a handful of sites with the PCA where we know we have a large commingled plume going underneath the roadway. We had one up in Grand Marais, so that is coming across the highway and going straight into the bay, into the water. And so when our project came through there, we partnered with the PCA and did a full remediation cleanup of that instead of just cleaning up our construction projects. So we are able to partner when we've got bigger known plumes. I think that was a successful project. We've done that a couple other places. I think we did it in Red Wing, and then we've also got a project in southern Minnesota in Casson that's coming up here where we've got some free product under the roadway, and we are going to assist the PCA with their broader cleanup goals there.
Well, thank you, everybody, for participating. It was a great panel.
Our next panel was our local funding panel, and our moderator for this panel is Charlie Vander Arty. Charlie is a government relations specialist with Metro Cities and has great insights into local government, not just in the Metro, but across the state of Minnesota. And so I thought he would be a great facilitator for our next panel discussion. Charlie?
Welcome back from break, everyone. Good morning. Good to see all of you and connect with some familiar faces. I'm excited about this panel. We have some great local government perspectives, people who work in redevelopment, brownfields every day. And so I won't take much more time, but just let you know that they'll highlight the role of local funders, local government units, and identify some funding gaps. We'll also hear about opportunities for collaboration between multiple levels of government. So we'll kick it off with Martha.
Okay, I want to make sure I'm going to be able to advance those slides. The little arrow. Oh, this thing. Okay. Oops. Lisa, help. I don't want to shut us down here. I'm like, I pressed an arrow. I think it's the wrong one. And then it's thinking. Yep. On screen though. Because. Great. Okay. Yep. Perfect. All right. Great. Good morning. Still, everybody. And since Charlie's here, I just want to say thank you to Charlie for the work that Metro Cities does to, be active at the legislature and be a presence on behalf of cities as a local government representative. I forgot to insert my contact info slide, so I'm going to, in a moment, show. If you Google Ramsey County Environmental Response Fund or Critical Corridors, which I'll also be talking about, you'll see a way to get in touch with me, and please feel free to reach out. So first, I want to start with the Bedrock kind of brownfield program that Ramsey County has offered since, I think, 2004. I forget the exact date. It was like a year after Hennepin County. We're the little sibling to Hennepin County, I guess. So you can see kind of on the left the main things that the Environmental Response Fund pays for: phase 2 environmental assessments, hazardous building material surveys, response action plans, soil or groundwater cleanups, soil vapor mitigation, asbestos and lead-based paint abatement. That is typically just for housing projects. And then the priorities for our Environmental Response Fund, I would say the one way in which Ramsey County might be distinct from some of the other funders you heard from Deed earlier, and Marcus is here too. I was going to be talking about Met Council. We in Ramsey County really have a kind of a super priority on affordable housing unit production, specifically the deepest level of affordability, 30% AMI units. So that is something that we're definitely looking for, as well as the other criteria here. And then about a year ago, we added in using the environmental justice area as defined by MPCA, which you heard about earlier. And then we typically split, we try to split, not always within every round, funds equally between St. Paul and suburban Ramsey County. And I'm just hoping that's not my phone. I don't think I recognize. Okay, phew. Like very likely could have been me. And you can see a couple of different recent projects that were funded by the Ramsey County Environmental Response Fund, the Hollows, and which is a project that's just getting underway in the Payne-Phelan neighborhood of St. Paul, and then recently the Highway 8 Business Center in New Brighton. And yes, so I'm going to move on now to talk about some new programs that we have that, because I'm managing them, I can't miss the opportunity in case it's of interest. They're redevelopment focused, and I would say definitely brownfield adjacent. So that is our critical corridors grants. Shoot, I thought I had the website on every page, but anyway, we have a new solicitation that's currently active. It opened on August 28th. It runs just for a month, and applications are due by September 28th. And the program goals are really more place-based investments, so boosting connectivity between transportation, housing, and jobs, creating more compact, walkable environments, enhancing pedestrian access and safety, supporting vibrant business districts. We have 3 different programs: a pre-development planning, a development and infrastructure, and a commercial corridor initiative. And I'm going to talk about the first 2 just very briefly today. I'm not going to read through all the items. There's also a map that we created that kind of overlays the transportation network along with transit corridors and other important resources. So pre-development planning is kind of what it sounds like. Requests of up to $50,000 are accepted, and this is the pre-development work. It's again going to be place-based, looking specifically, is it occurring within a defined priority corridor? Different kinds of planning activities, redevelopment feasibility and market analysis, infrastructure planning and conceptual designs, land use and zoning studies to reduce minimum parking standards or increase land use intensification within transit corridors, and equitable development policy and or plan development. You can see the link to the program page here. My contact info is on the bottom of that page, and who can apply is listed at the bottom, mostly public entities. There we go. Okay, and then next, the bigger pot of money, we have about 1.5 million in this round, is the development and infrastructure program. Eligible activities include paying for the extraordinary costs of housing, commercial, or mixed-use redevelopment projects, including clearing acquired property, installation of streets, utilities, and other site improvements, public realm improvements or amenities, stormwater management. Geotechnical soil correction is highlighted because that's a funding source that I know is important but not covered through very many programs currently. The cost of removing buildings and related structures through demolition, deconstruction, or moving, and parking and or parking removal within private development areas. And then there's another category related to public infrastructure improvements. And then a third category relates to strategic property acquisition. This is limited to public agencies who are preserving sites for future transit-oriented or higher density development. And here are the eligible applicants for that pot of money. The maximum grant request is $500,000. And for the two programs I just described, the deadline for applications is September 28th. And you can find all of the information about these programs, detailed guidelines, a link to apply on the URL that's listed below. And then finally, I just wanted to mention, because I'm part of community and economic development, a big focus of our department is housing. And we have been kind of turbocharging some housing funds within community and economic development thanks to the American Rescue Plan, which our board has reserved a certain amount of money for housing investments. And so there's another deeply affordable housing initiative that'll be launching in October. You can see the parameters there. There's definitely a synergy. Ramsey County is the smallest and most densely developed county in the state of Minnesota. And so essentially any development that occurs in Ramsey County is redevelopment, and usually there's brownfield presence in some form. So it's all interconnected essentially. And the specific URL, I don't know if that's live yet, but it is probably going live shortly. And it says it will focus on emerging developers and missing middle housing. I'm happy to answer questions at the end. And I think that's it for me. And now moving over to Kathy Undum.
Okay, great. Welcome everybody. I was just sitting here looking at this beautiful view, and you can barely see downtown, but how green it is still. Up north is starting to turn colors a little bit. So anyway, a bit more. Quite the challenge. So I wasn't really preparing a big presentation. So this is just a real basic general overview of what our programs are. And at Dakota County, we have the Redevelopment Incentive Grant, which was initiated at our Community Development Agency and was for our cities and communities as a redevelopment grant that has evolved into more of a brownfield component because that was the priority that was coming up. It was the environmental work that was driving a lot of the need. So our grant program is a rolling grant. It is based on CDA's fiscal year, which is July to June. And we refund, add funding every July to that. But it is a continuum. So the money is there until the money is not there. And it's available to all of our cities, all of our communities. And this year we have approximately 800,000, although that may be shifting as budget shift and as we find out where funding comes into the county from all of the other things, where we may be able to shift things around. So, you know, to be figured out as we go. Right now we have two grant types of planning grant and project grants. We are also looking at evolving this a little bit. That will be coming this year, of maybe tweaking these a little bit. And we do have a little bit of fungibility in those of what is a planning grant versus what is a project grant. We do the assessment stuff on both sides. So phase one could be planning or in the project. Cleanups are definitely in the project, but wraps could be in planning. So we have the ability to go back and forth on that. Because this is a redevelopment grant, we have the ability to do some of the more like deeds development So demolition, asbestos abatement, soil corrections. Dakota County is known for its dumps. We have a lot of dumps and we dig out a lot of stuff. That doesn't necessarily mean it's contaminated. So that puts us in a little bit of a bind of it doesn't fall into deed or Met Council. Our grant will help cover that. So we do have that ability in ours. These are the eligible activities. I'm not going to go into it, but these are there. These are the broad ranges that, because it is redevelopment, these are the things that it can cover. And here are the contacts. So go into our website. There's more detail. If you have any questions, call me. Call me early. Call me often. I'm here to help. You know, I like to say that I'm with the government. I'm here to help. That usually gets a good laugh. So then I add, I have money. And that helps a lot. So that's it.
All right. Well, I'm getting the impression that you guys didn't know we had money. We were up here talking about it the whole time. So I tried to put a lot on one slide. On this slide, really, I've combined some of the county programs, Ramsey County, Hennepin County, Metropolitan Council, and Deed that you heard from before. So what we really want you to take away from this is that, we have money offered frequently 2 times a year, roughly 8 million. We have some key dates on there. So coming up here, right, as Kristen mentioned earlier, our deadlines are November, but there's some homework that comes with that. So you have to have, if you're doing a soil cleanup, things like that, you have to have a RAP approval. And so really we're past that date right now. So you'd have to have that to the PCA in September. But if you're doing abatements and something else, you can still kind of slip in. So what we want to tell you is that there is a lot of opportunity. You've heard it before. We do, if you're kind of looking down in the corner here, we fund all sorts of different types of projects, larger industrial redevelopments. We just recently came back from an EPA award for the Northern Stacks. So a lot of industrial on a site that was extensive contamination. We've done residential projects, both market rate and affordable. Just like Ramsey County, we really are interested in, if you're doing affordable housing, are you providing units at that 30% of area median income affordable to those types of households or not? And really, how many of those? That's really a focus for us now. We have, we're Metropolitan Council, it runs the trains, runs the buses. We're interested in transit-oriented development. If you're building near those, we have funding like this. We have funding from other programs to help with that. And we haven't done a lot of public sites, but I know the counties have, so that's why I put that on here. So I guess what I really want to get a sense of is, here in the room, how many of you have applied to either one of the programs here before? Kind of show of hands. All right, so there's a lot of opportunity for just peer learning here too, right? So it's not just us. People have done it before. It's easier than it looks. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mary Finch with Hennepin County. It's great to see a lot of familiar faces here. Happy to be here in person. So just to cover the various funding mechanisms that the county has, I thought I'd touch first on our cleanup funds. So like Ramsey County, Hennepin County has an environmental response fund program too. We just last year celebrated our 20th anniversary of that program, which is pretty exciting. We've got 2 grant rounds a year, as Marcus mentioned. We coincide with Met Council, Deed, Ramsey County on that twice a year grant round cycle. We advertise that we have 1 to 1.5 million available each year, but if you were paying attention to the spring awards this year, we gave out 3.8 million, which is a lot more than advertised. And the reason we were able to do that is our fund, its source is the mortgage and deed registry tax, a percentage of that. There's just a lot of real estate transactions in the last few years, so that our fund balance has been going up, but that's not something that we can count on. So we don't advertise that as available each year because it really depends on what our fund balance is looking at. But as you can tell from our spring award, if we've got a lot of great projects and we've got a hefty balance, sometimes we're able to fund over kind of what we advertise. So keep that in mind when you're coming into us. So ERF is one of, again, our cleanup fund programs. And then we have an RLF too, like deed. And we may have to arm wrestle over RLF projects because we're trying to spend ours down too. So Kristen, you got some competition. Not sure where you're at here, but we have flexible timelines and interest rates on that too. So we are definitely looking for projects, and we've got at least 500,000 available, maybe more. So for folks who want to come into the RLF program, it's on a rolling basis, but it's a little bit more complicated than ERF because there's a bunch of hoops to step through with the federal dollars. It's coming from the EPA, so we want to make sure we've got all the eligibility criteria and all that other stuff met. So it's usually a 4 to 6 month process before you can start incurring eligible costs. And what we've noticed at Hennepin County is a lot of times people will pair that RLF funding with some other grants to kind of make up that full package of funding, and we can help you figure out how to do that on your projects. So for tasks that are eligible, really anything that's in your approved RAP, if it's a cleanup activity that the MPC has approved, or if it's lead-based paint remediation or asbestos-containing material abatement, we can cover that too. One caveat with ERF is just for affordable housing projects for that abatement piece, but really all the other tasks are covered by both programs, and eligible applicants are anybody for these: municipalities, local units of government, nonprofits, for-profit businesses, just not individuals. So a lot of folks are eligible, and then not responsible parties. Although if you have a legacy site, maybe a city that has a park that they've had for 20, 30 years, ERF is sometimes able to make some exceptions for that. And then for assessment funding, we do have some assessment fundings. It's a little bit more available to folks who are nonprofits and local units of government and not so much for private businesses. So if you're a city or a watershed or a housing redevelopment authority or nonprofit, you can obviously come into the ERF grant program. I think people forget that that's a great place for assessment funding too. Oftentimes we'll send projects that are really big assessment needs, 50 to 100,000. They could come into the ERF grant program for that. And then we've got 2 mechanisms with which we can do work on your behalf. So we've got this great partnership, obviously, with Minnesota Brownfields for their gap financing program. The seed money for that is ERF, but it allows for assessment on a rolling basis, and that's something that is done on your behalf, so not a grant you have to apply for. And also, not as well advertised, but Hennepin County does have some other internal assistance that we can provide. Historically, we have had some revolving loan projects where the loans have been paid back fully in principal and interest, and we were able to revolve that funding into assessment work. So we can do assessment for nonprofits, local units of government on a rolling basis as well. You don't need to remember all these sources of funding. If you have a project and you're a nonprofit or connected to a local unit of government, talk to us and we can help point you in the right direction. Unfortunately, the sources for private companies are a little bit smaller. Right now, we just have that ERF option for getting assessment funding. In the past, we've had EPA assessment grants, and I hope that we'll get some more in the future. We'll see how the process goes this round. We are definitely strongly considering applying, so stay tuned for that. Tasks that are eligible: phase 1s, phase 2s, development of RAPs, pre-demo surveys, kind of the gist of what we can do with those programs. And here's some more information just on our website where you can find more info about our program. If you got general questions and you forget who I am or my team is, you can email our general question. There's my contact info too, but I've got 2 of my colleagues here, Bria and Mike from Hennepin County, who if you've come in for an ERF grant, you're probably familiar with them. But if not, you should go introduce yourself during the networking break. That is it for my programs. Thanks.
thank you all for your presentations. And if you want to queue up your questions, we'll get going on those. But I have a couple just to start off here. So wondering, and something for maybe all of you, and a couple of you touched on this, is can you talk a little bit about the layer cake approach of funding and gathering funding for projects, and how some projects are big or expensive, and then they have assessment, and then there's cleanup, and you talk about a couple, maybe a project or two that required that, and how you advise some of those who come in for funds how to gather those different funds.
Charlie, I think for most of our projects, we do have multiple grant sources attached to them. If it's possible, just based on the geography, we encourage you to do that. The amounts, how we look at that is folks tend to, if they're applying for state funding, they tend to look at that pool first just because it's the biggest pool. But after that, it really is up to kind of how well your project meets the local grant priorities.
So I would say for ours, definitely intended to be matched to go with, Met Council and Deed. Also in some of those gaps where other funds don't fill, like soil corrections and asbestos abatement and other things. So the layering is definitely, and that's one of the reasons why we went with the rolling grant, is so that, ours is available. We're not on the same grant round, so you can secure one to secure another.
I was going to add something, but I'm not wanting to be contradictory. I mean, it is sort of a knowing the nuances of the different programs, and then also I think an advantage that I'm not sure if anyone mentioned it, but the local grants in Minnesota are all on the same schedule. And I know we like to pat ourselves on the back for our collaboration, but it is really an advantage to the applicants because we work, when a project is eligible for example, Deed, Met Council, and Ramsey County, I mean, we're talking to each other and trying to figure out how best to apportion funds so that good projects can get fully funded. So it is kind of it's not a either or, it's a really understanding all the different programs and how you can leverage them at different points, and then leverage them in coordination with each other to make your project viable.
And I would add that I say it's hard for any site here in Minnesota locally with brownfields to not have that layered approach to get work done. There's just a lot of cost that goes into cleaning up brownfield site, and we're really excited about those kind of projects that can come in and we can feed pieces of different programs into it. Those are the ones that I think, our team gets the most satisfaction from too, where we might be able to funnel somebody to Minnesota brownfields to start with a smaller phase 1, come to one of our assessment programs for a bigger phase 2, and then funnel into our cleanup programs. I mean, in that regard, our programs are then working as designed. We want to be able to help you do that.
Great, thanks. Okay, let's open up for questions from our audience. Kristen?
This question is for Martha specifically. On the critical corridors grant, if a project isn't, quite ready for this round, is it something that is open annually or planned to be open annually, or is it more often than that? Can you talk a little bit about the timing of that program?
Sure. Yeah, I sat down and immediately thought I forgot to mention cadence of like how frequently this is going to be offered. This is the critical corridors programs are funded through the county's Housing and Redevelopment Levy Authority. So this is going to be stable, ongoing annual funding. And I'm not sure exactly, it will be on an annual basis. I'm not sure exactly time of year. The time of year this year was just because this is as quickly as we could get them built. 2022 is the first year that we've had this source of funds available. So I'm kind of anticipating we might have another round next spring, but it isn't necessarily in lockstep with the brownfield grants, just because I see the brownfield programs in a lot of cases as coming in to help a project earlier, and then coming to planning. The planning grant would be even before the brownfields, and then brownfields is to do that site prep, and then coming to development and infrastructure later.
Do any of you are seeing any funding gaps, projects you have that aren't fitting into any funding resources, or where funders are looking to invest and help with projects? Everyone's needs are being met.
Well, I think a lot of times the smaller not-for-profit projects are don't always fit a lot of the program guys. Sometimes they do with some of the county programs, but really particularly for sites that really are not looking to expand, they're not necessarily rebuilding. They really are just maybe doing an interior renovation. Sometimes we can offer some abatement funding for that type of a project, but when it comes to, when we heard kind of that example earlier about the Wilder Square that Shauna provided, if it's an occupied home, it's an occupied business, nothing's really changing there, but they do have some needs. Those are difficult ones that I think we would like to address if we could.
Heidi, go ahead.
You're going to think that I'm planted in the audience. For a long time, people have known that I'm the squeaky wheel in the organization and that I like to talk about outstate Minnesota. So how about if one of you talks about the genesis of the ERFs that 2 counties have here, how that came to be, and then from a political, I think, standpoint, how that could be replicated elsewhere in the state.
Do you want me to on that? I was going to say, I think what we really need Ken Haberman to be in the room, and he's not, unfortunately. I did some research on this quite a while ago, but maybe Mary can furnish more of the Hennepin County context. My understanding is that that there was an application, I think, to the Ford Foundation back in the late 90s that provided some seed funding, and it went, I think, first to the Minnesota Environmental MEI, so Environmental Initiative, to administer funds within, I think it was St. Paul and Minneapolis. It was, and then it eventually moved over to Hennepin County first. But that was kind of that's the early piece before the legislature came in. I don't know as much about what was involved in that push.
Unfortunately, that was before my time.
Yeah.
But there definitely was, the climate was right, I think, at the time for folks politically to pursue this additional, I guess, distribution of a tax. And I think that because it's tax sourced, it comes up every once in a while as, a question about how are we comfortable with how our tax is being spent. So right now the program has a sunset date of 2028.
Yes.
So we'll look for it to be reinstated, hopefully again at that point. So, but I wish I could tell you how the project was.
Let me riff a little bit more. I know Marcus is trying to do a mic grab, but I'm gonna jump in. Everybody has thoughts. I was just sitting here trying to remember, what does the statutory language say? For Ramsey County, it specifically identified the Maxon Steel. I see Catherine sitting over there from the Port Authority. That was the first in the legislation that was passed, whenever it was, 1999, 2000. That was for the Maxon Steel site, and so that was kind of a pilot. And I do think that some of the thinking was there's these nasty handful of sites out there. We have to have this extraordinary source to clean them up. And I think over time it's been an education process in terms of helping folks understand that it's beyond the few really dirty sites to like brownfields is an issue that we're encountering in all redevelopments. Marcus, what did you want to add?
Martha, you really hit it right on. I think what Hennepin County also had that under there was the National Lead site in St. Louis Park. So I think it's just that idea that if you want to start a new one, you need a site like that, a site that you know has very incredible amount of difficulty in redevelopment, has brownfield problems, very visible site, a site that you can build a program around to help that one and others like it. I think that really was the genesis for both of those, as you can see with these two signature starting points.
Marcus, are you saying that brownfields are not just a metro area issue? Because I'm thinking that Minnesota Brownfields did some research quantifying that there's like, what is it, 10,000 estimated brownfields still out there in Minnesota. So Heidi, is that the implicit value statement in your question?
So my understanding of some of this, and this is where Gil Vansky would be the absolute resource on this, is there is a statute for a mortgage deed tax within Minnesota statutes that mortgage deed tax is collected. And that goes somewhere, not sure where. For the ERF, that was an additional 0.0038 whatever percent that was added on that was specifically for this environmental response fund. And Hennepin County was given the initial statutory ability to collect that, then Ramsey, and then there were some sunset issues and some no new taxes issues and some other things. But I think in the last re-upping of it, it did kind of open the door for any county in the state to legislatively apply to get one, to have your own. I'm not sure exactly how that was done. That was the last thing I remember talking with Gil about, is trying to get it open to the state, to all counties in the state. So the door was cracked. It is possible, but it is a statutory legislative thing.
Yeah, the language itself is just really focused on our two counties, but if you have a county that is interested in pursuing that, I would be happy to talk with them about it and kind of give our tips to, what we've learned in the process as we've had to go through that process of re-upping that authority. And I think that being said, for any brownfield funding programs too, if you have a city, a county, someone else who's looking at going after brownfields funding at a federal level or through any of our programs or starting their own programs, we're happy to give that advice. And you can be with us and pick our brain on it. Any of us would be.
We have time for one more question. Go ahead, Kristen. I will add to Heidi to that conversation is the realtors have perspectives on this, and they really highlight the cost of housing and the increasing cost of housing. And that's a headwind as far as expanding the mortgage registry and tax, saying it's already really expensive to buy a house. You want to be adding to the cost of housing, even if it's noble benefits to that. And that conversation has gotten louder at the legislature the last several years.
I just want, it's not an additional question, just a quick plug for Minnesota Brownfields and the KSU TAB program. Building support for using funding mechanisms, whether it's an ERF or maybe a local loan program or other things, does start with educating the community in building that support. And I know in a past role, Minnesota Brownfields and the KSU program played just a critical piece in that, coming in to help do community education and outreach and just kind of building that support. So just a plug for if it's something that you're interested in doing, both Minnesota Brownfields and KSU TAB are great resources for assisting with that.
you mentioned before kind of those gaps. I think the other gap that we're really seeing, you heard a little bit about the EJ screens. I think that aspect of equitable development, all of us are looking for sites that do that. And sometimes those small developers need that help that Kristen pointed out. And KSU is a good resource for that. They're here working locally with the Minneapolis green zones, both north and south, and they're working in the Rice-Larpenteur area, kind of near Roseville and Maplewood and St. Paul. So what I learned from working with them is that it's not obvious that brownfield funding is economic development. People don't really know that. You know it, but not everyone else.
Great. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Marcus. Thank you, Martha. Thank you, Kathy. Good conversation.
We are on to our last presentation of the day, and I thought Marcus's comment about all of us working to understand environmental justice in overburdened communities and kind of where that thought process sits in the field was a really important issue to address. So our last panel is a discussion on community-based criteria and the MPCA's environmental justice screening tool. And I'd like to introduce Ned Brooks. He is the MPCA's EJ coordinator, and he is one of the most experienced EJ policy people within Region 5, within the Midwest. For example, I know in my home state of Wisconsin, they just hired an EJ coordinator at the WDNR a couple months ago. Ned's been in this role for 9 years. So I think that consequently, Minnesota has a strategic advantage in the region to understand this criteria, understand how it relates to the Biden administration's clear priorities in this area as it relates to funding. And so I thought this would be a really instructive way to end the instruction this morning about how this particular criteria that we're hearing so much about fits into your projects in the field every day. So Ned, welcome and thank you.
All right, thank you. Wow, I'm feeling good about my job today. Really honored to be here. Really appreciate that. I'm not feeling like I've been in this job too long at all. Now I got experience and one of the most experienced people before you. So on environmental justice. Thanks so much. I will, here we go. You all know the Pollution Control Agency. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do, what we don't do, a little bit of context around environmental justice, what that means, talk about some of the tools and resources available to help you do a better job of serving underserved communities and applying for grants and funding. I'm not going to talk about funding that's available because you've heard a lot about that, but hopefully help give you a little bit of context about that. So we're the Pollution Control Agency. We protect human health and the environment, and our vision is to be a national leader when it comes to doing that. And we are a national leader. Whoops. Okay, how do we do this? You're all familiar with remediation programs. We do similar things when we find contamination in the air and water. We do a lot of education, outreach, and assistance. We regulate pollution sources. And a lot of pollution is caused by us living our daily lives. So a growing portion of what we do is targeted at that. Minnesota is a national leader in many areas, including environmental programs, and we take a lot of pride in that. We're hearing, what did I hear yesterday? Twin Cities is the second best place for Gen Z to live, right? I got a couple of those. We're always hearing about how, what a great place Minnesota is, and it's true. But when you peel back the layers, Minnesota is not, we're one of the most states with the greatest inequities. when it comes to outcomes in education, economic achievement, exposure to pollution, etc. So this is a top from NPR News. The quote in black is opinion piece from the New York Times. One example of that is it's not environmental, but it relates to housing and home ownership. Minnesota ranks as one of the top in the previous slides in home ownership in the country as a measure of economic achievement. However, for Black Minnesotans, we're near the bottom, and that gap is one of the biggest in the country. Is the biggest in the country. So in everything we do, we try to be mindful of that. So what is environmental justice? Talk a little bit about the kind of the formal definition of it. But for us, for Pollution Control Agency, our role is to really understand where those inequities exist when it comes to exposure to harmful stuff, the bad pollution, but also access to the good stuff. And we do that through monitoring. We do that through just understanding how conditions differ for people. Doing what we can to address any disparities we find, and more centering those who are disproportionately impacted in our work. So ultimately, trying to have a Minnesota be, the great state it is for everyone. We have a definition of environmental justice. Here it is. It's similar to the EPA's. It talks about making sure that everyone has access. There is not disproportionately impacted. That it's a right of all Minnesotans to have access to a healthy environment, and that we do what we can to, we call, meaningfully involve Minnesotans in our work, all Minnesotans. So fair treatment and meaningful involvement, the two things highlighted there, are kind of the pillars of environmental justice, and that's the EPA uses those definitions as well. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about fair treatment and meaningful fair treatment. Everyone benefits from our work. People aren't harmed or exposed to disproportionate levels of pollution, which they are. I'll talk about that in a minute. But probably more importantly, not everybody responds to the same stresses and exposures in the same way. And we've seen that with COVID has been a great example. People of color disproportionately impacted by the virus. And the same as with pollution. Young people, old people, people of color, lower income residents are more likely to experience negative effects exposed to the same pollution. So a key part of environmental justice is not just making sure that everybody's exposed equally, but making sure that those who are more vulnerable and who may be more at risk are centered in our work. Okay, so we've got pretty good air quality in Minnesota for a state of our size, in particular in the Twin Cities. But it's not as clean as we'd like it to be. About half of communities in Minnesota experience air pollution that's higher than we'd like it to be. But when we, look at the data and segment out populations and how they're exposed, we find 61% of communities that are have higher concentrations of lower income residents are experience air pollution that's not as healthy as we'd like it to be. And 93% of predominantly people of color communities are exposed to air pollution that's higher than we'd like it to be. So that's a pretty staggering glimpse that we've only recently been able to do because of our modeling air pollution prediction techniques. But an example of what I mentioned as wanting to look at you know, how pollution may expose people differently. So we use this and other data to drive our work. When it comes to remediation work, it's not that stark, but certainly the majority of cleanup sites are located in lower income communities and communities with a higher percentage of people of color. So that's something that's important to this topic, and I'll talk a little bit about how we identify that in a moment. But I also just want to further the discussion to talk about how these inequities, it's not by accident. There have been, yes, historical development patterns and people living close to work and living close to other people, et cetera, influence where people live. But a lot of you are familiar with redlining. It's probably one of the most stark examples nationally of policies in the past that have ended up influencing where people live and contributing to some of Minnesota also has some of the most segregated neighborhoods in the country. So just being mindful of that and aware that we're working on reversing a system that has helped advantage middle income white people in Minnesota and the country. So just to put this in perspective, the lasting impacts that policies like this have had. This is a view of Minneapolis, and showing on the left the kind of the modern depiction graphically of the maps I just showed, and in the middle, what we consider lower income communities and majority people of color communities. And you can see similarities in that. So these persist today, and then overlaying that, some of our air pollution data and the location of air pollution sites, we see that these disparities that exist today have roots in some of these policies. Okay, that's about disproportionate impact. Hopefully I've left you with the understanding that people of color and lower income residents are disproportionately impacted by air pollution, proximity to cleanup sites, et cetera. Another big part of environmental justice is meaningful involvement. And meaningful involvement really means that we go out of our way to engage people who typically aren't as involved in the process, and that we give people equal opportunities, and that we close the loop and keep people's involvement in ways that's authentic and has a chance of influencing the process. That's what meaningful involvement is like. And it doesn't necessarily, it's perhaps not as important from a health and exposure perspective of the pollution exposures and effects, but it's an equally important part of the environmental justice. And what do we mean by that? And maybe some of the practices. I can't remember who mentioned it. Talking about many of the grants we do across a variety of programs ask participants to talk about how they're going to involve residents, especially lower income residents and people of color. So just what we think about first is understanding the community and understanding what barriers they may face, both in terms of, can I have transportation to a public meeting, for example, the barriers that exist in people's lives, but what are barriers that we put up too by our jargon and our, where we hold meetings and how we reach out to people. So thinking about that, engaging early in the process is really important. Oftentimes we wait till the end, and it's harder to do authentic community involvement if it's on a short timeline. Getting to know people and establishing some trust takes a long time. Anyway, some tips here on community engagement. There's a lot of resources. We've got some stuff about that too. So that's a little bit of an overview about what environmental justice means for us as a government agency in the state, and how we view it in our work. So the first approach is understanding where higher concentrations of low-income residents and people of color live, and people who may be disproportionately vulnerable to the effects of pollution, and take a look at how we approach our work in those areas to do what we can to understand those risks and improve conditions in those areas, and engage more often. And we're working on integrating that into all of our programs at the Pollution Control Agency. So I want to talk about how we understand what we call areas of concern for environmental justice. It was referenced by a couple of people today. So the let's see where to start on this journey. As a lot of my colleagues at the Pollution Control Agency are like, yeah, this sounds great, but how do we go about this? So we looked at what other people were doing, states, and local government, and decided on this approach, which uses 3 criteria to determine areas of concern for environmental justice. Census tract, U.S. Census tract based, and we have 3 criteria. At least 40% of households are below 185% of the poverty level. The federal poverty level, the dollar amount, it hasn't changed. So with inflation, et cetera, we need to apply multipliers. So 185 or 1.85 times the federal poverty level is what one criteria that was used, and 40% of households in an area. If 40% or more households are at that threshold, then we consider that to be census tract that is an area of concern for environmental justice. Or majority people of color. This is all, of course, based on the. Where did we come up with this? At the time, it was something that was used by the Met Council of racially concentrated areas of poverty. Now it's changed to be referred to as concentrated areas of poverty. I'm not sure if it's still in use. Do you know where? Yeah. So that was, we attempted to work with other state and local agencies to try to have consistent criteria around that. And then also included tribal areas. So 40%, currently 40% of the census tracts in the state meet this criteria, and about 30%, representing about 38% of residents. That's based on the recent updates, based on the recent census, which, because Minnesota's population is growing and changing, well, we added 100 some census tracts because our population has increased relative to other states in the region or the country. And we've also had an increase in the number of people of color and other shifts within census tracts. So we've actually increased as a result of the latest census what are areas of concern for environmental justice. And then federal tribal areas, that's the third criteria. So we consider an area of concern for environmental justice if it meets any one of those criteria, all 3. This is a fairly simplistic view in that it uses only demographic information. At the time when we were working on this in 2015, this predated EJ Screen. Actually, EJ Screen came out about that same time. And while we were also considering including environmental and health indicators, when EJ Screen came out, we decided to rely on that for that supplemental information. I'll talk about EJ Screen in a moment. So we have an online screening tool. You can find it on our website. I have a link yet here. If you just say NPCA EJ, it'll pop up. Where you can, as Shauna mentioned, enter an address, zoom in. It includes these 3 criteria. It also includes language. You can find out what the census tells you about languages. It has air pollution risks and the location of all the sources, the facilities and entities that we regulate, and cleanup sites, etc., all layered in on this map. So that's our screening tool. We're in the process of considering how to the next version of this to include more environmental and health indicators, and so we'll be adding those. We've added air pollution recently to have it be more reflective of environmental conditions. But in the meantime, my EJ Screen slide. Here. So how we use that throughout across our programs to both in our regulatory and cleanup programs, prioritizing inspections, for example, of facilities located in areas of concern for environmental justice. When we have a backlog of permits that we're looking at, we prioritize those. If we have a high number of sites for vapor intrusion, it's a criteria, it's a factor we use in determining which to address first. We also use areas of concern for environmental justice in our grants and technical assistance. And in some of the grants we issue, I've seen it up to 30% of the eligible points for awarding a grant are you providing services and improving conditions in areas of concern for environmental justice. So that's a significant one. And of course, we use it to understand where it makes sense to do extra outreach and engagement on top of what we normally do. Here's an example of how this can be used in looking at cleanup sites and overlaying that with areas of concern for environmental justice. And there's a greater concentration of cleanup sites in EJ areas than in other parts of the state, as you mentioned. Okay. Matt mentioned, and others have mentioned EJ Screen. EJ Screen is a really powerful tool that gives information. It does not decide, does not make decisions for you. Our tool says you're in an EJ area or you're not, or you're near. What EJ Screen can do is to supplement that with a lot of great information. It has many more variables. Kind of see them in the middle here: environmental indicators, health indicators, demographic, etc. This is Superfund proximity to census tracts, and it uses a percentile rating. So when you're filling out applications for grant funding, for example, you can use EJ Screen. A lot of information there, depending on what the criteria may be, to help you support your application for various grants if they talk about environmental justice as a priority or other things. Another resource Matt mentioned was the Council on Environmental Quality tool, which is similar to EJ Screen, has a more of a focus on climate justice, but those are some tools available. Okay, I guess that's it. Hopefully, I've left some time for questions, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thanks.
So, Shauna, if you already answered my question, I apologize. But I'd like to better understand the intersection of what Ned just talked about with your recently funded $2 million statewide EJ tool. Or I should say EJ assessment money.
This is on, yep. So the point of the $2 million grant, right, is to do assessment work in EJ areas, right? And so however those come to us, right? If it's a neighborhood community group, if it's an apartment building and they're working with a community, whatever it ends up being. So the point is to try to assess and get some of the sites in EJ areas cleaned up, right? Because they're still disproportionately impacted. So what can we do? Well, this is one thing that we can do because we have the opportunity to apply for the grant. The tools Ned's talking about are, yeah, how we decide if the site we're looking to fund assessment work at is in an EJ area. So we plot it. Like you said, the PCA tool tells you you're in an area or you're not. There's lots of other cool things you can learn about if you use some of the other tools that might help as well.
Which I stole this map from a presentation Shauna and I did together, so I put that up.
Ned, you mentioned the interest in adding more environmental data. Cumulative impact is something that comes up often when talking about environmental justice. Does the agency have an opinion on how to measure cumulative impact right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're in the process of coming up with our own definition of that. And we actually have a beta version of a tool that takes the best data we have in Minnesota and weights it, and ends up giving a score for each census tract on environmental justice. So yeah, we're in the process of that. But that means something, can mean something different to different people. Even varies from state to state. The EPA has a definition, so we're trying to understand what that means for us. But basically, the concept is that we can't just say, this pollutant is too high in an area, or let's just use air pollution as an example. We have standards for the concentration of a whole variety of pollutants in the air and what's considered, and benchmarks, what's considered to be healthy in that. That's an individual pollutant. But what about the combined effects of multiple pollutants in the air? What about the combined effects of air pollution versus skin absorption from contaminated soil? So those are chemical stressors. And on top of that, what are the combined effects of non-chemical stressors, if you will, stress about economic security, noise pollution, fear of safety in your own home? These things we all know affect people's health. So how do we combine all those? That's what we're working, and it's a very, very interesting and rich field for people who work in that area. But it's not just enough to say this one pollutant has these consequences.
Interesting. So if you can get the airports to lower their noise pollution, that'd be great. Just an aside. No, in all seriousness, should we consider this tool as sort of don't think any deeper about it? Or if we see something, we say, you know, it's outside of your area, there has to be a bright line somewhere, but it really meets the criteria when you get boots on the ground, say, that's something that we should be thinking deeper about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's obviously if you're across the street from an area or, you know, or just outside, that's one way to think about that. I mean, we need to be, as government, thinking about impacts on all people, of course. This is a starting point. It's a starting point for, it's also, our tool is based on demographic data, which is imprecise. So we need to vet what we learn through government data sources with community knowledge, for example. So on a variety of levels, all of these tools are really just
I have a question. I'm not sure if you guys know the answer to this or not, but in that 40% of areas of concern that you've identified, do you have any sense of the split between outstate and the metro for those, you know, percentage where those places are geographically within the state?
That's a great question. We do have more kind of analysis of that available. I will say that outside of the Twin Cities, the areas are driven predominantly by income. There are certainly concentrated areas of people of color outside the metro area. In fact, some of the counties with the greatest, or the census tracts with the greatest percent people of color are located in greater Minnesota. But yeah, I don't have that off the top of my head. It is available.
One advantage of getting old is, you know, having some institutional knowledge
Can
about.
relate. Vista.
Yeah, we should talk. So I just want to make sure that you folks at MPCA are remembering that about, and I bet now it's close to 10 years ago, Minnesota Brownfields partnered with our Department of Health to create a health indicator assessment tool that was premised on brownfield decision making. So it is on our website, I hope,
Minnesota
I believe,
Brownfield.
and so, you know, it is something that perhaps can be. I just don't want it to be forgotten or on a shelf, and for someone like you to know that it exists and that thought process has been going on for a long while, and it might be a way to enrich the data that you have.
Yeah, thanks. We do list other resources on our website, and I don't think that's one of them. And that just emphasizes that this is a starting place. And if you have a specific area you're working on, like brownfields, that there's other layers. I like Charlie's layer cake comment. So there's multiple layers, and this is a starting place. But yeah, thank you for that. We should have that more accessible.
Perhaps one last question, but I want to bring it back to Greater Minnesota. So I think one thing that we feel as staff out in Greater Minnesota is with all of this money coming out, it's great opportunities, but we're few and far between and stretched relatively thin. So is MPCA and some of the community outreach positions that you've talked about and some of that outreach kind of plans, is that targeted towards trying to reach some of those Greater Minnesota areas? Because when I think about some of these areas that are highlighted with the tool, I think those are some of those areas in Greater Minnesota that feel that stretch the most. And so how's MPCA reaching those people and those projects.
Yeah, sounds like Sean is gonna.
And Amy's here too. But yeah, the point of those community outreach positions are to target the entire state. We don't want to just do metro or non-metro. We want to be able to reach the entire state. And that's one of the reasons we do the assessment grants the way they do, right? It's not a grant. You don't get reimbursed. We do the work. Yeah, because a lot of places, no one has the time, right? No one has the time to become a grant writing specialist or to administer it or to worry about like if they're tracking it correctly. So we're trying to make it as easy as possible. It's really low burden of entry and then easy to work through once you're in it. It doesn't mean that redeveloping brownfield sites are ever going to be really easy, but it'll be a little easier.
Seeing no other questions, I'd like to thank Ned again for coming today. Thank you. Welcome back. And I'm going to do just one final thank you to Megan Doberstein here in the back in the black t-shirt and the black and white pants. Megan is our account executive with the Harrington Company and really did all the legwork, logistics, and planning so that this could be a smooth running day. And I really appreciate all of her work today. So thank Megan as you're leaving today as well. Well, now it is my pleasure to introduce Kirk Koldeka, who is the Assistant Commissioner for Land Policy and Strategic Initiatives at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And in reading Kirk's background, I thought it was super interesting that he has a really extensive legislative background. That's actually where I got my start as well. And when I read that, I figured Kirk's probably got a great sense of humor because you have to in order to work with the legislature. So welcome. And when we were putting this program together at Minnesota Brownfields, we really thought, okay, let's get into a lot of detail in the morning, but let's spend some time at lunch pulling the lens back and looking at more of a 30,000-foot perspective on how the state of Minnesota is implementing the infrastructure law. And you've heard some speakers allude to programs that need legislative authorization, others that do not, sort of each agency having its particular niche that it's working on. I know Kristen mentioned broadband at DEED. And so Kirk is here on behalf of the Walz administration to talk about what the larger vision is for infrastructure in the state of Minnesota, talk a little bit about what might be coming up in the state legislature, where we as a Minnesota Brownfields organization might be able to plug into that process, but basically just give you a broader view shed of what's happening with infrastructure. So I appreciate Kirk being here. I know he has a really busy calendar, and please join me in welcoming Kirk this morning. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for hosting this great event. I'll be talking a little bit here about some of the work that we're interested in doing and sharing information about the various grant programs that are out there because of the infrastructure bill. And this is one of those models on how do you share information with colleagues on those opportunities, get that information out so that we as Minnesotans do better all together. So, I was told that this is part here is everyone was going to take notes on the very detailed conversations, and I'm the quiz you. So I think, so we'll start off real quick. What does IIJA actually stand for? We probably all use the short version. Okay, I even have to look it up because we want to refer to it as the infrastructure bill. It's the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So all joking aside here, this is a great opportunity for Minnesota to meet our larger goals, to protect human health and the environment, and also make sure that we're able to enhance thriving schools and work locations. And we're going to do that through opportunities to bring clean energy solutions to the table and also infrastructure that is resilient to climate changes. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the $7.4 billion of investment that by formula are allocated for Minnesota, but also talk about those other opportunities that are out there. many of them competitive, many of them that we need information from others on how to administer them to meet the actual needs out there. And so I'll highlight a little bit about that. But these dollars don't come without strings. Many of the policy items were talked about in the earlier pieces, and that does need a state match. And we'll talk a little bit about how we're doing that on the legislative level and what the governor has proposed and how we want to make sure that we maximize the benefit here for Minnesota. Having said all that, this is also a great opportunity to invest in those areas that have overburdened pollution or have been overlooked in other areas. And so the federal government has really attached what they call Justice 40 to it. And I'll talk a little bit about that too, and how at the MPCA, we're looking to advance that too in our grants, not only those connected to the infrastructure bill, but across the spectrum. So real quick, want to just highlight the amount of dollars available, $1.2 trillion. It sounds like a lot. It sounds like everyone talks about it as new money. Actually, it's two bills. It is roughly a $650 billion reauthorization of the Federal Surface Transportation Program. So this is existing money that folks had thought were going to come through the system, and a reauthorization of that. Then the remaining $550 billion are new dollars of spending, which are for general infrastructure programs. Again, heavily weighted towards roads, bridges, transit, but also water, energy efficiency, climate resiliency, broadband, and we'll talk about those in a little bit more detail. It's also broken up into these two pieces. You see the formula grants. Those are existing programs where the federal government is pushing more dollars through to recipients that are already scheduled to receive it. And on the state level, we have looked and believe there's potential there for $7.4 billion in ongoing existing funding already and new dollars that will be coming to the state. And then what really can set us up against other states is how successful we are at applying for those that have the competitive grants process, whether that's agencies or public and private entities throughout Minnesota that can access those dollars. And I know folks earlier talked about the number of those in the Brownfield area, but this is seen all across the spectrum, not only in the Brownfields area. Some of those examples in that formula we talked about are transportation, but also $76 million for the weatherization assistance program, $100 million for broadband development, and then $18 million for state and local cybersecurity enhancements. Now, this funding is a little different than what we have seen in other recent funding mechanisms from the federal government. This is not flexible, such as the CARES or the American Rescue Plan. These have very specific uses and criteria that are set out by Congress, and then in some cases, the agencies will add a level of detail. Here's a good example of that breakdown of that's coming through the formulas. You can see, again, no surprise from the existing funding being there from the federal dollars. So transportation, the lion's share of dollars are going to that area. But even there, it's still $2.2 billion in new formula funds coming to the various state agencies. At Council, because of transportation, Public Facilities Authority, this is largely clean water, drinking water systems, and then wastewater treatment plants. And it's going through the Public Facilities Authority, PFA, and our MPCA staff, along with the Department of Health, will be helping work through those dollars. You also see here the great need for match. Nearly 85% of those dollars are requiring a state match, which has to be authorized by our legislature. And I'll talk a little bit more detail here on the next slide about that. The governor pulled together all their agencies and started to ask, where are the matches needed? In last legislative session in 2022, the governor's budget, supplemental budget, included the dollars so that our state could hit the ground running and be able to start using these formula fundings or competitive grants that we knew that we were interested in applying for as soon as possible. Now, the bad news is the legislature didn't pass any of these dollars. So we're still out there waiting for those matching dollars to come to the state. Good news is we have one more legislative session to be able to do that in 2023. So our goal as an administration is ensuring that Minnesota gets its share of the dollars through the formulas and also puts ourselves in a competitive area for those other grants that we're going to have to compete against various other entities. And so you can see here, the governor recommended nearly $390 million in this last biennium to help things from the transportation funding to EV charging stations infrastructure to what we need for drinking water and wastewater treatment plants through PFA. So, you'll can imagine that you'll see this again as the governor puts forward his budget next year to go to the new legislature to move these items forward. So I want to just talk about some of the examples. We're not going to be able to go through all the funding areas that are available, but I've picked a couple just because they are great examples of how the dollars are coming to the state and how state agencies are looking at the dollars and what type of things that we need to do, and also our partners may need to do to access these dollars. The first is the Public Facilities Authority. As you can see, nearly $660 million divided between drinking water systems and wastewater treatment plants. These are administered by PFA with the help of the Department of Health for drinking water and MPCA for the wastewater. Again, here you see the match, and on the previous slide, we asked for nearly $50 million to provide that match to make these dollars available for loans for local units of government as they build these systems and provide these services to their residents. You can also see examples here of dedicated funding for lead service line replacement and emerging contaminants, and these are no matches. However, these are examples of areas as the state is trying to administer them. We're seeking input from others. What type of projects would they like to use? Determining, do they fit in the criteria or the box created by the federal government? And if we have good ideas that don't, start talking to those federal agencies about, let's move those lines to allow for new and additional projects to be available. So I'll use an example here of the emerging contaminants. This is really often talked about as funding to address PFAS, whether it's for the drinking water systems or the wastewater facilities. And on the wastewater side, where MPCA staff work with PFA on this, there's a very narrow lens of how these dollars could be funded. We can look at end-of-pipe treatment for wastewater treatment plants to deal with PFAS, which is very expensive. When the state put together our Minnesota PFAS blueprint, we really said, let's look at the sources. How do we get rid of the sources so those conduits like a wastewater treatment plant or a landfill aren't accepting these materials, and then we don't have the problem on the back end where it's more expensive. However, us to be able to do some of that monitoring up front to determine where those sources are, or pre-treatment pilots to see what type of technologies could move these sources away, is not eligible for federal government. So many states, including our commissioner, are leading the conversation with EPA and our delegation of how do we open up the authorities here to allow for those innovations to match the type of projects that are going to have the biggest bang for the buck. That's one of those areas where if you have ideas where maybe the line is not drawn exactly the right way and it doesn't make sense, we're open to hear those ideas as we continue to work with the agencies, the federal agencies, on administering these dollars. In some cases like this, they're pre-existing programs. That's going to be a bigger boulder to move. But in other cases, we'll talk about some programs that are still being developed, and we still have opportunities to nudge how these dollars can be spent. So another example of some types of programs are MnDOTs. And here are some examples of how our agencies are looking at this. It's not only as agencies moving forward, getting funding for their programs and staying within our box. A good example here is the bridge that spans between Duluth and Superior, the Platnick Bridge, where not only is Minnesota working with its internally with its agencies, it's also working with Wisconsin to seek the funding, creating those partnerships to put us in a better position for a competitive grant, in this case, for this bridge project. The EV infrastructure is another example of where MnDOT is actually the one applying for, but a lot of work is being done with the other agencies, including the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, to determine how do we build this plan for our joint goals to reduce greenhouse gases from the transportation sector. The last example I want to highlight here are the RAISE grants, and this stands for Rebuilding American Infrastructure with Sustainability and Equity. You can see where this is one of those competitive grant programs where it's not only state agencies, and MnDOT has received some funding here for a project on Trunk Highway 197, but a number of other local entities across Minnesota have been very successful. And to the point where the state has received probably more than its population share of dollars for this grant because of the success of those local governments being able to apply for it. So an example that ranges from tribal entities such as the Boys Fort Transportation Facility built in Northeast Minnesota, to projects in Duluth, Rochester, Minneapolis, and Plymouth that all received these raised dollars. Again, this is not only an opportunity for state agencies, but for local entities, private entities, to really be able to position Minnesota in a good position. But then just a quick recap here on what this funding looks like for Minnesota. $7.4 billion over the next 5 years in that formula funding, about 2.2 of it being new dollars. In addition to that, those formula funds, it's going to be competitive grants that are out there that are still being formalized. And I just want to highlight how that looks like. As agencies, we're seeing a number of different grants coming through, close to 400 different grant opportunities coming through, and we're all shifting through it and trying to determine what phases are they each in. The formula ones or pre-existing programs like the Brownfield grants that were talked about earlier from EPA, where they put money in pre-existing programs, those dollars are going out the door, announcements have already been made, but there are many, for instance, like our solid waste ones from the federal government that have not been decided yet. These existing programs for the Recycle Act or the Save Our Seas funding, which is to help with plastic, trash, and recycling, the EPA is still putting together what those programs look like. And so over the spring and summer, I've been asking many stakeholders, and we've been part of those conversations on how do we want to prioritize those dollars. And the goal then is for EPA to put forward its funding request in this fall or winter for all of us to be able to apply for. So there really does happening in phases across the process. So one of the efforts to help others through this process also is the state's put together a long list of each of the agencies and contacts and leads for each of our program areas. I've only have a sample up here, and I can provide the longer list here. I put up a sample for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, a DEED, and also MnDOT, given that those are some of the programs and entities that you work with. But for each agency, there's been a point person identified to start having those conversations and really be able to steer people in the right direction. Just behind the curtain a little bit, we each have teams within our own agency that are led up to funnel that information in one spot so that we can have a comprehensive and holistic approach at how we're applying for grant dollars. So I want to talk a little bit here about some of the dollars that have come in already to the state and MPCA specifically, and two of them specifically about Brownfields. Shauna talked earlier about the community-wide assessment grants for states and tribes, so I'm not going to get in too much detail here, but the state did receive a $2 million grant for the next 5 years to do work that we have successfully done before, which is to help with those assessment and cleanup plans for various sites, with the priority being targeted areas in Minneapolis along Lake Street, West Broadway, St. Paul, University Avenue, and a corridor in Cass Lake, but also other areas that have seen overburden and are seen as EJ areas. And John talked and Ned talked about a little bit how one of those criteria is looking at those environmental justice communities. And those dollars are available soon, and you'll be hearing more from us. And I know we went into details already, so I'm going to move on to the next one that you may not know as much about. So the agency has been doing a larger revision of how we deal with brownfields within the agency. As you know, we've had brownfield programs within our petroleum and our Superfund items. But what the agency recently done, and it's not all that public, is we created an entirely new section dedicated to brownfields. And that also is now under a new leadership. We have a new manager And Jessie Ertz, many of you may be familiar with her work already in Brownfields effort, is now our new manager of this dedicated section to Brownfields. Part of this revisioning of how we handle Brownfields within the program also involves a successful grant that we received from EPA to help with a number of program enhancements. We received $1.1 million for this next year, and that's going to help us focus in a couple areas. First is community outreach and engagement, specifically in those environmental justice areas. It was mentioned a little bit that we're hiring that staff. This is going to allow us to really have connections with, not only strengthen the connections with the communities and entities we've worked out with before, but also go beyond that, go beyond the usual suspects and start building new connections with communities, especially as we're looking to do with those assessment grants to drive community-driven projects that may not necessarily move forward straight because of market decisions. Grocery stores or open spaces, community centers that the community may want, which may not work in an investment strategy. In addition, we talked always about how we want to move more and more of our materials to electric data. And we've talked about that before, about how data submitted in the Brownfield program would go through our EQUIS, which is our groundwater database. This staff will also allow for us to work on that, actually that transformation and that transition. And so that would be providing more guidance in that to entities in the Brownfield program, building the tools to make that transition, much like some of our other programs have done in MPCA, but also in a remediation area. Super fun for those who are multi-site contractors have been using this, along with some of our other programs. So this is really to advance that forward. As I mentioned, this is really to help with enhancements to the overall program. This is not bringing additional staff to do the routine Brownfield work projects. And what this is doing is filling gaps that we've identified and really trying to build that vision of a more holistic program as we fill in some of those areas. So I mentioned at the very beginning, Justice 40 and EJ work and how that is being driven on the federal level in their grants. I also just want to talk about here too, as Ned and others have talked about, how we're trying to drive that into our agency efforts and our decision making. And this is part of that ask or challenge too for wider groups, not only for us as internal agency folks, but other entities to come on this journey with us. And so that's as folks are looking for redevelopment opportunities, really want to look and see how do we not only look at market-driven decisions, but what are some community-based efforts that move forward. And the Minnesota Brownfields Rescape Awards has done a great job of honoring some of those really unique, excellent projects. What we want to do is see how do we get more of those out there. And so that's one of our efforts and challenges we're putting on ourselves with the assessment grant and the new staff, but also want to put on the larger Brownfield community too. Also, when we are doing those projects, which may be commercial, industrial, or others that are very important too for the economic viability of our communities, also look at it through the environmental justice lens. How do we engage the community earlier on with conversations on how those projects move forward? I started in the legislative area. One of the things we had a lot of conversations about was permit timeliness. And I remember our program leads would always say, the first thing, if anyone wants a project to move faster, is if those proposers, before they even come to the MPCA, start having those conversations with the local community. Start talking to them about their projects, start hearing about their concerns, and how can they address those concerns before they even come into us with a permit. And that holds true with the Brownfields, and many of you have done great work in this area. But just want to keep that lens on and focus on that area of, as we're moving forward with the projects, how do we involve the community in it? Making sure that they're aware of it. As we're doing a commercial industrial property, are there tweaks or change that we can do to address the concerns of the community, or maybe incorporate some of their needs into it as we're moving forward with that project? We as an agency will continue to look through that lens. One of our efforts on a diversity, inclusion, and equity is looking at how we disperse our grants and making sure that they are going to areas that have seen overburden of contamination and pollution. And that's something that you'll see more and more in our grants, whether it's through our Brownfield programs or all other parts of the agency. So with that, those are my prepared remarks. I'm more than happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you for having me. Everyone's so quiet. There's got to be someone who asks that first question. It breaks the ice. So thank you.
My job always has been. You have your 2 new community outreach people. Will they be housed in St. Paul or will they be located in other parts of the state?
To be determined. Overall, we are trying to do more work at the agency to open up our positions to statewide efforts. If one silver lining of this whole COVID issue, we have learned that we don't necessarily all need to be in St. Paul. And you've seen the transformation in our agency, even in our leadership. We have for the first time our division directors. We have outstate Greater Minnesota folks division directors where we've never had before. We were very hesitant to have that. And so you've probably seen in some of our applications, we're opening it up beyond just St. Paul on some things that may have been there in the past. So I anticipate that as we look forward at these positions where they're located, we'll have that same philosophy there. Where they actually be will depend on a number of factors, including the applicants.
Other questions for Kirk? Kirk, I have just a quick question for you. We talked briefly when we were preparing for this meeting about the provisions in the Federal Inflation Reduction Act that could have ramifications for the Brownfields program and giving preference to climate and energy projects that are in brownfield areas. Have you in the agency had a chance to think about how that might look in Minnesota? I know that there's always some statutory barriers with landfill redevelopment and things like that. I'm just wondering where, it's very new, but just wondering where you guys are at with that.
So I don't have anything specific to report, but we do have a climate sub-cabinet, which has looked at the infrastructure bill and now the Inflation Reduction Act. And especially in the Inflation Reduction Act, a lot of dollars, maybe not directly to agencies or entities, but like you mentioned, tax credits. So we're going through that together as a cabinet. Sub-cabinet, so that'll bring in Commerce, ourselves, Deeds, to look at those to be able to really parse that through. In terms of Brownfields, you mentioned that there are state requirements or limitations that have been an issue. And, MNCEA, which is the Solar Industries Association, a couple years ago sponsored legislation for a study to really look at those items. And UQP led that along with MPCA and other agencies. And we do have a number of recommendations in there on how to move forward projects, including some of those restrictions that have slowed things down. And a big one is a lot of these, when we're looking at the closed landfill program, it's 111 that are under the state's care. They were used for bonding dollars. And it's those restrictions that are in the way right now of some development. And in that report, we've identified avenues forward for those.
First, a comment. Thank you to the MPCA. I work for the St. Paul Port Authority, Catherine Sarnicki. And without the programs that the MPCA has, the properties wouldn't get developed. The liability assurance that you guys provide and the guidance that you provide allows this to work in Minnesota. And being in Oklahoma City for the National Brownfields Conference and seeing Shauna talk about what's going on in Minnesota, Minnesota is ahead of the rest of the nation. And it's, I think, because of the work of Minnesota Brownfields and the work of the PCA. So kudos to you guys. And then my question is, if you have new department heads, are there new departments? What's the new structure?
Sure. So we still have our remediation division, and it was divided up to various areas. And Brownfields was kind of tucked in Superfund and petroleum. We've now put a Brownfield section on the same level as Superfund, closed landfill program, and petroleum remediation program. So we're really trying to put a focus to it and prioritize that in a way that we haven't before. Some of it will help us administratively behind the curtains. You'll never see the changes, and they'll help us. but things like the grant dollars, the staff to help with community outreach, to transformation, to electronic data submittal, and then also that'll make it easier for you to be able to grab it when you need it on data requests in the future. I'm not promising any timeline on that just yet, but that is the ultimate vision, is to also make it easier, not only for us to do our work, but for you to do your work. Since the lion's share of the data requests that come into the MPCA are folks asking about properties and doing those important looks at the properties as they're doing their phase ones and every effort. So long term, this is to help others too. So, you know, the division's still the same, still have the same leadership and structure on that, but really just trying to pull up Brownfields, put a little bit of spotlight on it, and prioritization. And I want to thank everyone here too. I know we've got great staff that have done a tremendous job, other agencies, but it's this organization, Minnesota Brownfields, the work done here, the awards to highlight it, the report that was started by Minnesota Brownfields and now agencies working on, really gets that story out there. And so that's what makes success. People want to be part of success. Whether it's St. Paul Port Authority having a great project and having that strong communication out there, making sure folks understand what can be done and bending what people thought possible. We were just up in Fridley talking about an IROP site and doing what others didn't think was possible. And so it's because of that, the community is really what helps make Minnesota lead. It's everyone's effort.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. Time. Thank you again to all of our speakers for donating their time to be here today. We really appreciate it, and we could not survive as an organization without people contributing their professional expertise to days like today. I have just a couple really short announcements before you can get out and enjoy what looks like a pretty warm day today. I just want to alert you that our members only event in Mankato has been rescheduled to October 18th and 19th. And this is really a session for our members. It'll be capped at 50 people. And it's to talk about the merger of environment and economics as displayed in the Mankato City Center redevelopment projects. And I think it'll be a really interesting session. We have a developers roundtable and some other interesting speakers. So take a look at that on our website. Our annual State of Brownfields conference will be on November 15th, so right after the elections at the state capitol. It's really going to be a session that's about connecting the capitals and learning about public policy initiatives, both retrospectively and moving forward on Brownfields. So I really encourage you to take a look at that. And we will do that in the afternoon of the 15th with a happy hour kind of social networking event to follow. And then finally, just for your calendars and as you're thinking about interesting projects you're working on, our Rescape 2023 event is scheduled for April 6th. We are going to be at the St. Paul Event Center again this year, and the nominations for Rescape are live on our website. So I encourage you to take those neat, interesting, creative projects and put those forward to nominate them for our annual Rescape Awards. And the MacHide Scholarship, if you have any interested students, the MacHide Scholarship application is also now live on our website. And with that, that concludes our day. And thank you. Thank you all for attending and supporting Minnesota Brownfields. We appreciate it.